This story took place a long time ago. It's the story of a human king who opened the door connecting his world to another. After what happened, people fled in terror. They were filled with fear at the sight of magical creatures crawling out through the open doors. The world beyond them turned out to be the home of demons who inhabited it. Countless demons kept lurking, and the world, once calm and peaceful, was thrown into chaos. Many people died, and the ground beneath their feet was stained red. The king of men began to pray to God, asking him to send the power to destroy those demonic creatures. Then a blinding light fell from the sky. The monsters under that light scattered in a cloud of black smoke. Some people received a special mark and gained magical abilities that allowed them to fight terrifying monsters. Others called them wizards and began to worship them, and peace once again reigned in their lands. However, the question remains, was it really God who granted the king's wish? It was God. The sounds of music came from the palace. Many people gathered there for the ball. The beautiful young woman whimsically claimed that she thought there would be wizards here. If she had known there would only be nobles, she wouldn't have come. The maid addressed the girl as Miss Saren and said there were rumors of a possible appearance by the Dark Wizard. Serene said that in that case, that she would sing just one song and leave immediately. The maid recalled that an alarm had been raised in the Lupinos forest due to the presence of monsters, and that a caravan passing through the forest had suffered serious damage. Saren was outraged to see that after all this, the nobles continued celebrating as if nothing had happened. She thought she would like to meet the Dark Wizard. The audience was eagerly awaiting the performance of the singer Saren. Many of them had heard that she had a truly angelic voice. Serene looked at the faces of the audience in surprise. She hadn't even started singing yet, and horror was already reflected on their faces. After Serena, monsters appeared at the windows of the hall, and the audience fled in terror. Serene watched the approaching monsters in astonishment. She couldn't understand what they were. The figure of a stranger suddenly appeared in front of Saren. He shielded her from the attacks with his own body and lunged at the monsters. This stranger was a rather handsome young man, dressed in black. The monsters kept trying to get into the hallway through the windows, but they were destroyed by the young man in black. The monster's blood splattered in all directions and landed on Serena's face. The maid ran over to Saren and asked me if she was all right. Seren said that the man was undoubtedly from Opinion himself, a dark mage. She told the maid that he was the dark mage. The maid tried to calm her down and said they should first get her to a safe place. The crowd was stunned when they heard about the dark mage. Someone said he was a celebrity from a place called Opinion. They say that he saved many lives that day. The dark mage saw Saren and approached her, asking if she was hurt. Serene replied that she was perfectly fine. The dark mage said he was glad to hear that, and in that case, even though now might not be the best time, could he ask her a favor? Serene replied that, of course, she would do anything. The dark mage said that maybe, in that case, he could get her autograph. He handed her a piece of paper and a pen and asked for her autograph and her name. Opinion. The dark mage was walking down the hallway. People around him whispered in surprise when they saw him and tried to talk to him. At the same time, the dark mage himself couldn't get the thought out of his head about how much he hated crowded places. That's why he didn't want to show up here in this uniform. Suddenly, a female voice called out to him by name. Blue. It was the beautiful Wren who asked him what he was doing at the main entrance at that hour. He had come to deliver a mission report to the master. The dark mage replied yes, and added that the job was nothing pleasant. Wren said she was glad he had finally managed to do it. Blue noticed she was holding some documents and asked what they were. Wren replied that it was nothing special and hurried off, saying the master was in his office and suggesting they have lunch together later. As she left, she dropped the document. Blue picked up the newspaper and called out to Men. But then his eyes stopped on the contents of the sheet of paper. It was an intrusive ad for the services of a dark mage. Wren was horrified to learn that Blue had seen what was written there and asked if it was the master's doing. She said it was supposed to remain a secret and tried to justify herself by saying she was totally against it, but the master had decided it that way. Wren wanted to say something else, but Blue had already left. The man in the office was standing in front of the window. He was enjoying a drink in the nice weather when the dark mage burst into his office. He was outraged to see someone open the door as if they were about to rip it off its hinges and got a piece of paper thrown in his face. Blue asked what it was, referring to the document. The master was very pleased to see that it was Blue who had arrived and said he had been waiting for him. The dark mage was irritated. He pointed at the piece of paper and demanded to know what it was. The master quickly tore the sheet into tiny pieces. And then Blue innocently declared that he didn't even know what he wanted to show him. Blue was indignant and claimed that he hadn't had any peace lately. Wherever he shows up, he's overwhelmed by a crowd. First, he has to come this way, and then he does something similar. The master mockingly said that the star Blue turned out to be a shy person. Finally, Blue lost his temper and slammed his palm on the table. Even the master flinched in surprise. Then his face lit up, and he joyfully said that Blue had finally managed to get Serena's autograph. Blue said this was the last time and that there would be no more ridiculous errands under the pretense of missions. The master said it was impossible. There are important tasks here that only he can do: finding Ellen's lost puppy, delivering Rowan's love letter. The master claimed to have gotten an autograph and said that Siren doesn't talk to strangers because of her difficult personality. Blue said he didn't notice anything strange, although she seemed shaken by the attack, which alarmed the master. He said that the Ravi area where Serene operates is considered a safe zone, so did they really run into bandits? Blue replied that monsters attacked. They weren't very strong, but it was strange for them to show up in Ravi, which is protected by a tower. The master responded that it was really odd and that it definitely needed to be investigated. And it's good that even under those circumstances, he still managed to get an autograph. He also asked how long Ruth plans to stay in this form. He replied that, thanks to someone's stupid missions, he possessed a huge amount of magical power. At one point, he was given the name Blow, the Awakened Release. The master noted that Ruth had matured a lot since their last meeting. He chuckled in response, as if to say, seriously? Ruth stated that, since he had brought an autograph, now he should be assigned a normal mission. The master said that since that day, the mages have been keeping an eye on Ruth, and Chick from the association is especially looking for him with determination. He added that the situation would soon become much more dangerous, which worried him. Ruth asked if those were the words spoken by the man who had created that, and showed a flyer advertising the Dark Mage. Then she said that the jokes were enough, regardless of whether he would give her a new mission or not. The master replied that it was something very important. Once a year, an auction is held where rare and unique items are sold. This time, it was announced that a magic stone with a name engraved on it would be auctioned. In other words, it's a top-tier magic stone. The master said that the problem is that other mages know about this stone, so this mission could be pretty fun. The master looked at a document and thought that he had never been able to show it to Ruth. She probably would have gotten furious about that. It was a letter about the admission of Ruta Christie, 15 years old, to the Helios School of Magic. This time, a lot of people gathered for the auction. The Master of Ceremonies announced that the moment everyone had been waiting for had finally arrived. The auction begins. Ren said there are a lot of people here. Is the magic stone called the Heart of Shajarn really that amazing? Ruth replied that it was now rare to come across a high-grade magic stone. Ren noticed there were a lot of mages there, and she slyly asked if the Dark Mage was sure he could handle it. Ruth said there shouldn't be any problem. Everyone has their own goals, and he has his. Ruth wondered to himself what the master found so amusing about all of this. He remembered asking the master what the mission was. The master replied that someone who had inflicted deep harm on his client would appear at the auction, so he was looking for an agent of revenge. A vile mage has completely ruined his client's life and is seeking well-deserved revenge. The master said he had made inquiries and discovered that the mage was a typical villain who exploited and deceived the weak. He handed Ruth a piece of paper that said, Dan Marshall, whose magical name was Cloak, was a third-rank mage who had previously been imprisoned but had received a warning and been released. Ruth expressed her hope that the master wasn't asking her to kill him. He replied that he couldn't just be allowed to die. Since the auction will feature a high-quality magic stone, a lot of people will gather there. In such a crowd, you'll first have to find him and catch him. Ruth asked if they should torture him or just break his legs, but the master said that after catching him, she had to pull his pants down. Ruth was outraged when she heard such an order. The master explained that the mage had been a member of the criminal organization Coatl, which was destroyed, but several of its members managed to escape. Raiden, where the auction is being held, holds a deep grudge against Coatl. It's said that co-op members had a tradition of branding a special mark on their legs using lemon venom, which couldn't be erased. And if this mark is revealed in front of a large crowd, the revenge will be simply wonderful. Ruth asked what would happen if it was just a rumor, and after unmasking him, there was no mark at all. But the master said that even that alone would be excellent revenge. Ruth said she wouldn't do it and tried to leave, but in the end she gave in and now watched as the auction began. When Ren asked him if he was sure about all of this, he replied that he would manage somehow. The girl was amazed by how many people there were and leaned over the railing to look. The man accompanying her brought her back to her seat and told her that the princess shouldn't be playing there. The girl said she had a feeling something interesting was going to happen there and asked Tessie what she thought about it. She turned to the young woman standing at the door, but Lady Tessiano was asleep. In the box next door sat a young man named Lapis. His companion advised him to focus and pay close attention to what was happening. A lot of magicians have gathered here, so something interesting is bound to happen. Lapis agreed with his father. The man with wolf ears addressed a young man named Shik. He reminded him that his mission was to protect the magic stone. It had to be protected, not destroyed. However, Shik kept plucking leaves from the branch and ignored him. The man with wolf ears repeated the instructions, but the girl asked him to be quiet. She kept plucking leaves from the branches. Finally, she plucked the last one. After that, she stood up and said she would come. Meanwhile, the auction continued. The master of ceremonies announced that the main event of the day had arrived. Some of those present might already know. This is an incredibly rare and valuable item. The most powerful magic stone, imbued with the power of the mighty Shajarn. The host presented the most valuable magic stone to the audience, the Heart of Shajaran. The audience was amazed. The manager noticed the blinding glow and immense power of the stone and declared that they had the chance to become its owner. Ren asked if he had already found the target. Rudd replied that he couldn't see it clearly. He explained that everyone's auras were mixed together and that maybe something had changed and he hadn't come. Then, Ren said it was time to start getting ready. Rudd drew the curtain of the box. He said his name was Blow and activated the awakening. Ren stated that this show is fascinating. Magicians who can change their appearance can be counted on one hand. He added that a kid like him can quickly become a very handsome young man. Ren asked how his mana lust. Rudd, or rather Blow, said he had mana to spare. But more importantly, it's already starting. They seemed out of the ordinary. The soldiers guarding the auction were confused. The unknown man held a blade to the butler's throat and shouted at everyone to back off. He and his accomplice looked at the magic stone. They declared that Shajarn's heart now belonged to them. Ren stayed calm and asked Blow who he was. The guards approached the kidnappers and shouted at them to drop their weapons. One of the kidnappers said they needed to pull back here. Suddenly, a powerful sonic explosion hit the guards. The soldiers were left unable to move and quickly lost their ability to fight. The magical blast came from a strange object the kidnapper was holding in his hand. After a while, the manager and the guards were lying helpless on the ground. The kidnapper mockingly said he was so bored he couldn't wait any longer. He claimed that's why they were taking that stone, and he reached out his hand toward it. However, someone grabbed his arm and stopped him. It was a man with wolf ears. The kidnapper smiled and asked who he was, and received a powerful surge of magic in his hand. A glow shone behind his injured hand, and he said he was a visible mage from the association. When they heard mention of the association, the crowd began to murmur. Someone remembered that, in fact, there was a mage with a tail and ears in the association. He was the association's hunting dog, the Nost's bloodhound. He chuckled when he heard the conversations among the crowd. He said they were the real dogs and asked which bastard dared to call him a bloodhound. One of the kidnappers muttered something about those damn half-breeds from the association and threw the magical object he was holding at the man with wolf ears. The object hit him on the back of the head. The kidnappers watched expectantly to see what would happen, but the man with the wolf glasses didn't suffer any visible harm. He glanced sideways at the kidnappers and said it hurt. Ren said in surprise that she thought they only had weaklings, but it turned out they had an ace up their sleeve. But surprisingly, it turned out to be a mage from the association. Blow told Ren to take a closer look. That man was the same mage who had been with him before. Both kidnappers were knocked unconscious. The man with wolf ears addressed the mages and warned them that if they acted rashly, things would end badly. He added that anyone who touched the magic stone or showed suspicious intentions would have to deal with him. After this warning, he was about to leave, but suddenly realized that the magic stone had disappeared. Someone in the crowd shouted that he was over there and pointed to a huge statue. On top of the statue's head stood a young red-haired man holding a stone in his hand. It was Shikmon. He said he definitely felt it was there. The man with wolf ears couldn't understand what he was trying to do. Shikmon held out the stone and said that if Chernish wanted it, he could try to take it. Otherwise, he would eat it. Rumors spread through the crowd that this was Shikmuon from the association. Ren looked at Blow and said that with Chernish, he was probably referring to him. Blow responded with silence. Ren said that everything was much more complicated than he thought, that if they showed up, things wouldn't end well for them, and suggested they withdraw. But Blow said he wouldn't abandon the mission over a speck of dust, a particle of red dust. Ren could only express his hope that somehow they'd manage to get out of this situation. Someone in the crowd said they'd come looking for a high-quality stone, but because of Shikmon, their chances of getting it had vanished. He said there are a few mages here, so maybe it's worth attacking them all at once. But they replied that everyone was on a different level compared to Shikmon, except that Chernish could stand up to him. Meanwhile, Shikmun stood with the stone above the statue's head and the stone in his hand. He said it seemed he hadn't managed to scare him. The man with wolf ears shouted at him to stop fooling around. Suddenly, a powerful magical force fell upon the statue. The man with wolf ears and Shikmuon looked at each other in surprise. A crack ran through the statue and it began to fall with Shikmuon standing on top of it. The man with wolf ears shouted about what was happening, but the statue had already collapsed. As the dust from its fall began to settle, a figure appeared. It was Lady Tiziana. The man with wolf ears asked if this was her doing. Lady Tiziana replied that she had come to participate fairly in the auction and even brought a silver one. Then she looked at Shikmon and said that he had interfered in her business, but he objected that she was the one getting in the way and called her crazy. Ren said that woman with blue eyes appeared out of nowhere, but thanks to her, this whole thing dragged on and they got a chance. She asked Blow if that was true. He answered yes. Suddenly, she noticed a man standing among the crowd next to a woman. You could see earrings on his ear and on his lip. That was the person they were looking for. Blow said they had finally found him. The sounds of battle were coming from the auction house building. Lady Tiziana was fighting against Shiklin. The blue-eyed girl was very serious and kept attacking her opponent relentlessly. But Shikmun wasn't about to give up either. He successfully blocked all of his opponent's attacks. Shikmun asked why those who don't know their place dare to show up. She replied that he wouldn't be able to make her angry and kept pressing him. But then Shikmun launched a counterattack and threw the girl far away. She hit the ground with a tremendous crash. The audience watched in amazement as the battle unfolded. Out of the cloud of dust appeared the silhouette of a girl rising up. She said her name was Tiziana. Shikmun watched her closely. The girl used awakening. Shikmun asked her if she really thought anything would change if she awakened. The girl replied that he should get ready, and she lunged at him again. The princess shouted that Tessie had awakened, and it looked like it was gonna be an impressive show. But the companion replied that they would have to go back, given Tessiana's behavior, since she was supposed to go with them. He added that they had come there in secret and that he would get in trouble if anything happened to her. The assistant said they should leave before something worse happened and tried to take the princess away. The situation among the crowd was quickly approaching panic. Shouts could be heard telling people to evacuate. The situation got worse when a magic stone fell into the crowd. The hunting dog made its way through the crowd, pushing people aside. He thought irritably that since Shikmun had decided to fight, he should have handed over the stone first. At that moment, Blow, trying not to draw attention, walked through the crowd. He followed his target, the man in purple. The people around him were focused on the magic stone, but for him, this commotion was the perfect opportunity. He thought about how to show the emblem on his leg without raising suspicion. Taking off his pants didn't seem like a good idea. While Blow was thinking, a man next to him shouted out where the magic stone was and who had stolen it. Blow approached him and said he had seen a man dressed in purple taking the stone. He pointed to the man he was following and said it looked like he had hidden the stone in his pants. The man lunged at the man in purple, grabbed him, and demanded that he return the magic stone. Blow thought his plan had worked. However, the man ended up injured in the arm and was thrown aside. The man in purple drew his sword and asked how they knew he had almost managed to take it. Blow thought that it was definitely him who had taken the magic stone. The man in purple declared that since he had the stone, he definitely wasn't going to give it up. He said his name was Cloak and that he used Awakening. He added that he possessed the magic stone and would kill anyone who dared to take it from him. The crowd backed away in terror, but then a man appeared out of nowhere and blocked his path. This was Blow. He lunged at the man in purple and with just a few blows disarmed his enemy. A spear appeared in his hands and he pointed it at Cloak's face. Blow said it wouldn't be so easy to take him down. Shikmun was watching closely, just like Lady Tessiana. Both of them ran to the scene of the fight. The Cloak was sprawled out on the ground. Someone in the crowd shouted that it was black magic. And it turned out they were right. Dark Mage. Cloak shouted that the magic stone was his and he wouldn't give it to anyone. Blow asked why he thought the stone belonged to him. He also said he wasn't interested in the magic stone, that he needed something else, and stared intently at Cloak. Suddenly, an attack was launched at Blow. He deflected the sword that was flying toward him. Blow watched as a new enemy approached. Suddenly, a hand grabbed him by the clothes. It was Shikmun, who said, "Hey, Blackie." Blow and Shikmun eyed each other warily. The shockwave from their collision spread throughout the hall. The crowd began to scatter in horror. Lady Tessiana was recovering from the fight. She said it was pretty painful. Plus, she lost her sword. Tessiana pulled herself together and said that next time she won't lose. Cloak did everything he could to escape. The crowd chased after him, shouting that he had the magic stone. Cloak was furious. How dare those damn pests bother him? The weak should step aside. However, one of the bystanders caught up to him and asked if he really thought everyone there was weak. He hit him hard. They got into a fight, and a crowd started to gather around them. Lapis witnessed the battle between the Dark Mage and Shikmen. He thought that if this kept up, the building would collapse. Lapis wanted to turn to his father, but he wasn't there. He asked Runo where his father was, and she replied that His Excellency had already left. Lapis thought that leaving now would be the safest option, but he really wanted to see the battle between powerful mages. Meanwhile, Ren was very worried about how things could end up like this. The presence of Shikmuan in the association was a miscalculation on his part. And besides, she didn't take the magic crystal with her to restore her power. Ren thought that the longer it dragged on, the worse it would be for Blow. So what should he do? Shikmun and Blow were standing face to face. Blow said he had no intention of fighting him. Shikmuan replied, "Oh, really?" Blow stated that he didn't need the magic stone. And wasn't his goal to protect her until the end of the auction? At least that's what his companion claimed. Lo said that, therefore, it would be better if each of them minded their own business. He also added that his magic runes looked ridiculous and advised him to take them off. Shik Muan said he didn't care whether he needed the magic stone or not, or if anyone knew how long he'd been searching for it since that day. Opinion hid it as if it were some kind of treasure, but Sheik Muan accepted any task or mission where there was a chance to find it. Lo thought that lately he'd been busy with other things, like getting autographs or dropping his pants. Shik Muan declared that now it was right in front of him and lunged at Blow. They collided again. Shik Muan said he wanted him to show it to him again. That moment, the photo gave him goosebumps. Before he does it, I'll kill him. Shards of glass fell from the C9. Someone shouted that the building was collapsing. The dog Lacoste headed toward the scene of the fight. Seriously, Shik, are you going to destroy everything here? He's way too excited about what's happening. Lacoste thought the auction had already been canceled, but if he managed to recover the magic stone, it would be an excuse. Meanwhile, Cloak was surrounded by people. They demanded that he return the magic stone. Cloak tried to push his way through and fought back with magical attacks. The man Blow had spoken to earlier shouted that he had magic stone in his pants. Cloak tried to explain that it was complete nonsense, but the crowd was moving toward him menacingly. He shouted that it wasn't true and that they shouldn't come any closer to him. Suddenly, Blow disappeared. All Shik Muan had left in his hands was a piece of Blow's cloak. Blow appeared inside one of the crates. The girls who were there looked at him in fear. He said the situation was getting really dangerous and that it was best for them to leave quickly. The girls took his advice. Blow thought that some kind of nonsense was going on. Why would he waste his magical power on a pointless fight? He remembered that ever since that day, the master had only given him strange missions. Could it be because of that, guys? Almost everyone in the audience has already left the auction house, even though the mission is pretty much failed. He still has to make sure if that mark is there. Shik Muan said that since the Dark Mage had no intention of fighting, he would have to hand him over. There are too many distractions here. When all this garbage is over, someone's going to have to change their mind. Suddenly, threatening noises were heard from above. Under the influence of magical runes, the building's ceiling began to collapse. Cloak saw that the ceiling couldn't hold up any longer. He shouted to his pursuers that they'd better look up. He thought that if he kept running, he might have a chance. But then, Blow knocked him down with a magic strike and told the other onlookers it was time for them to leave. Life is worth much more than a magic crystal, so everyone had better get out of here. Blow stated that the building could collapse at any moment. Lacoste shouted at Shikmian to stop immediately. There are still people here. Are you really going to kill everyone? Ren thought irritably that things had really gotten out of hand there. She decided to quickly find Blow and then use the teleportation scroll to get out of there. She felt a bit uneasy about what was happening. The Dark Mage was standing in front of the fallen Cloak. He said the Dark Mage turned out to be an idiot. He sent people away from here to keep the magic stone for himself. Blow replied that everyone judges others by their own standards. Or he asked Kotal's Cloak if he was one. He said it was nonsense and had nothing to do with Quaddle. Blow said he should have a mark on his leg and that he was still trying to make a living somehow in Radin. He added that, judging by the reaction, it was true, but that he would have to check everything himself. Cloak shouted at him to stop. He said he would give him the magic stone and handed it over. But then a powerful magical blow struck him. Someone said he had claimed he wasn't interested in the magic stone. What's the point of dealing with this trash? What's the fun in that? Shik Muan was standing in front of Blow, holding a magic stone in his hands. Lo suggested they try talking first, but Shik Muan stood his ground and lunged at him. He grabbed him by the leg and threw him far off to the side. Shik Muan invited Blow to play with him. The Blow landed nearby. He thought that guy was way too serious, and it looks like a fight is unavoidable. The opponents started getting ready to attack. Suddenly, Blow felt the magic he had gathered disappear. Shik Muan also realized something was wrong. Lacoste ran toward them and looked around, surprised. Strange magic circles appeared on the floor of the hall. The audience present in the room became alarmed. No one could understand why magic circles were appearing here. Some strange crystals appeared in the circles, and then monsters started coming out of them. The crowd began to scatter, frightened. Bruna followed her young master. Lapis asked her where those monsters came from, and she replied that they had crawled out of the magic circles. The monsters started attacking people. Lapis demanded that Runa hand him the sword. He said that, of course, his skills might not be enough, but it's better to fight than to just stand here like an idiot. Lapis stepped in front of the people who were being attacked by the monster and told them not to worry. But then a powerful blow from the monsters sent him flying far off to the side. Runa quickly rushed to his aid, and she reached the young man just in time. Runa gently landed on top of him on the ground. He wondered what kind of monster had appeared, an ugly Medusa or a giant octopus. She summoned a magical bow and aimed it at the monster. Lacoste shouted, "What is this? Are these really summoning circles?" Lacoste looked at the dark mage in surprise and said he looked just like him. Blow asked if there were really mages who could summon monsters, to which Lacoste replied that he had never heard of such a thing. The dark mage said that summoning so many monsters, especially in a place like this, seemed pretty strange. Ren ran toward them, and Blow asked her why she hadn't left yet. Ren got upset and declared that she wasn't going to leave alone like a coward. Lacoste looked at her and wondered who that girl was. Apparently, she was Opion's companion. Even though she didn't seem like a mage, she called out to Shikmon. He appeared immediately, along with stones falling from the ceiling. Lacoste asked what had happened to the magic stone. Shikmuin said that the stone was no longer there. It disappeared. Ren told Blow that they needed to get out of that strange place and that she would use a teleportation scroll to do it. Blow wanted to object, but then Shikmon declared that he wouldn't let them leave. He shouted that no one had given him such a right and attacked Blow. Ren was outraged by what he was doing in that situation, and she demanded that Lacoste stop his companion. Blow suddenly said that the magic hadn't disappeared, that apparently it was just a temporary phenomenon. He asked Shigmoan if he felt anything strange. He replied that he had also noticed the loss of magic and that he didn't think it was anyone's fault. That something was wrong, especially since monsters had appeared. Blow said that now wasn't the right time for them to fight, but Shikmuon replied that he didn't care and lunged at Blow again. He launched a powerful magical attack at him. Ren was horrified. However, Lacoste stepped between the dark mage and the Blow, taking the hit himself. He told Shikmun to calm down. Men who are too pushy are really unpleasant. Ren said that now, because of all this commotion, the mage tower would swarm over here like flies, and that they had agreed to try to avoid them. Blow said that Lacoste had taken the hit so easily that they should just leave. But Shikmu wasn't about to let it go that easily. He told Lacoste that he wouldn't forgive anyone who got in his way. Blow wondered if that guy was being serious. Ren reminded them that if the mages from the tower showed up, it would be a huge expense, so they needed to leave quickly. Blow shouted at her that there was danger behind her. Ren turned around and saw Lapis with a sword in her hand. She attacked the monster, which had snuck up behind her. Lapis asked if she was okay. Ren looked at him, surprised. She thought she should be the one asking if he was okay. Runa asked if she should help the young master. Meanwhile, Lapis was thrown backward by the monster's blow. Blow killed the monster with a single strike and asked Ren if she was all right. He said it was a low-level monster, without a core or intelligence. Runa approached Lapis and asked if she was all right. She looked at Ren and Blow and said that was the Dark Mage. And that guy is Shikmon. These are the most powerful mages. Blow looked at Cloak, who was lying among the rocks. He thought he still hadn't finished with the confirmation. Ren yelled at him to just forget about that damn mission already. He felt like it was going to be a bad day after the rough night he'd had. Good thing he brought the scroll with him. Blow said it would be best if she left first. But she, indignant, asked if he really wanted to drop his pants. Lapis and Runa were left stunned when they heard their conversation about pants. Lo said there were still monsters and people left there, but Ren replied that the tower would take care of everything, that it was entirely their job. She called out to Lapis, and she said that, although it would be an exaggeration to say he helped them a lot, wouldn't they like to leave with them? Lapis thought about it, and Ren said that if he didn't want to, but he agreed right away and said they'd be very grateful for the help. Lacoste said he had an unbearable headache, and that he thought he was getting a migraine just from thinking about having to write a report about it. He blamed Shikmun, who was dragging him along, for everything that had happened. Ren said, "The destination is wherever I want. The condition is contact." Blow explained that they needed to hold on. Lapis watched with concern as Shikmun approached. He asked why he was running away and where that bastard who used to be so sure of himself had gone. Lapis looked at him with concern and told Blow that the mage was looking at him like he wanted to kill them all. He replied that there was nothing to worry about, that he was probably just having a staring contest with himself. He urged Ren to hurry up, but she asked him not to distract her since she needed to concentrate. Shikmun shouted that he really thought he would let him go so easily. Damn, Turnus. Suddenly, the magic circle on the building's ceiling began to glow intensely. Lacoste shouted, "Whatever." Lapis said it was the same thing. Blow urged Ren again. She focused. And finally, I activated teleportation. A powerful explosion shook the auction building. A magic circle landed in the palm of someone's hand, and it was crushed by this hand. A man with slit pupils and a small monster on his shoulder said it was pretty fascinating. He asked his companion if she agreed with him. His companion, a young woman with small horns whom he called Lady Ruby Montier, was sitting nearby with a magic stone in her hand. She said there was nothing interesting here. Putting on such a show unanimously, just like that. And she crushed the magic stone in her hand. Ruby Montier said with disdain that humans were despicable creatures. The master's office, in her opinion, the master said that the auction building had been destroyed, the magic stone had disappeared, and an unknown monster had appeared. He added that it was a very amusing scene and burst out laughing. Ren said he sent them to take the wizard's pants off and they got into a huge mess. It must have been really fun. The master said that despite everything, he was glad that both of them had come back, safe and sound. If he had known that Shigman would be there, he never would have sent them. He wondered why that guy was so obsessed with Blow. It seemed like it wasn't just a desire to fight. Still, this family has always been a little crazy. Ren was surprised to learn that the family was involved. The master said that in time he would lose interest, so for now it's best to avoid him, even if it's unfair. He added that something didn't add up in the case and that he started to get suspicious when he heard about a high-level magic stone at the auction. The mass summoning of monsters and the disappearance of magic power can't be ignored either. Ren stated that this incident would cause a big stir in both the association and the tower. The master also asked where Ruth had gone after tossing that unfinished report onto his desk. At that moment, Ruth was sitting in the tavern reading a book. He said that, as expected, there were no records of monster summonings. Then, a small boy approached him with a cup and told him his drink was ready. The boy's name was Ben, and he stood out because of his green hair. He told Rudu that it had been a long time since they'd seen each other, probably because he was always studying so much. Then, looking at the book, said that everything was really complicated. He didn't know his brother Rude was so smart. Rod replied that he had just realized that himself. He asked why there seemed to be so many visitors today. Ben said there weren't that many, and that everyone was busy talking about the Dark Wizard's feat. Rudd looked confused. Ben started to explain that Ravi had a valuable magic stone and that an evil wizard wanted to steal it from him. But the Dark Wizard showed up and saved everyone. Ruth smiled shyly, remembering that the place had been destroyed by an explosion. Ben said he hoped his sister would become a powerful mage like the Dark Wizard. Ruth was surprised to hear what had happened with his sister. Ben explained that she had recently enrolled at Helios School. But it was more than just a regular school. Helios is a prestigious institution reserved only for exceptional and extraordinary people. Ben said it made him really sad not to be with his sister, but at least he could write her letters. His mother told him not to write her too often, so she wouldn't get distracted. But he had already written 10. Ben said he had to take care of other customers and ran off. Ruth listened to the conversations of the people around her. They talked about how Shikmung won, how the Dark Mage saved everyone there, how Cloak swallowed the magic stone, and even that the Dark Mage was a woman. Ruth thought about how many rumors there were and how just one guy was taking all the blame. But for some reason, no one mentioned the monsters. Maybe the tower had something to do with it, since the city was protected by its barrier. Maybe something happened to its barrier. Ruth thought it was a good thing she had drawn the magic circle she saw there in detail. Maybe it would come in handy in the future. After finishing her drink, she decided it was time to go see the master. Strange noises were heard coming from the roof of the building in Abian. A woman's voice asked what was going on. Lisbon replied that there was a bit of a commotion up ahead, but there was nothing to worry about. She asked if everything was all right with Mrs. Dyer. Mrs. Dinah replied that everything was fine and there was no need to worry unnecessarily. She added that if she could be of help to this child, she would do everything she could to make it happen. Ruth was walking down the street, looking at the piece of paper she held in her hand. She thought that just by looking at that magic circle, she wouldn't get any answers to her questions. A sudden gust of wind snatched the paper from her hands and blew it down the sidewalk. Ruth hurried to grab the piece of paper. She briefly wondered how far she would have to run, chasing after the sheet. The young man shouted for them to give it back immediately. The leader of the group of suspicious-looking people claimed that he had simply picked up the bag that had been thrown on the ground. The young man tried to explain that he had only let go of it for a second, but the leader grabbed him by the neck. The leader said he might have considered it if they had begged him, but instead he shouted. He told him to think carefully about whether he would die first or if the guards would come running. Then a piece of paper hit him in the face and he threw it away in annoyance. The leader added that in any case, the bag was hid now and that he'd better get out of there as soon as possible. Picking up the piece of paper, Ruth said sadly that it was dirty. The bag, which had been the reason for the argument, was hanging from his arm. The leader shouted angrily, asking what kind of kid he was. Meanwhile, Ruth gave the bag back to its owner. The bandits yelled at her to give the bag back, but Ruth said she had also picked it up and politely asked them to leave. The young man quickly ran off with his bag. The leader said threateningly that since that little bastard had ruined everything, he needed to be taught a good lesson. He ordered his accomplices to block the exits. Rude determined that he was facing a weak mage, low-level and with limited powers. The leader said that it seemed he didn't know how things worked in this world, so he needed to be taught a big lesson. Rude decided it wasn't worth getting into trouble and that it would be better to just run away. He lunged forward and, under the surprised gazes of the bandits, jumped off the roof. At that moment, a carriage was passing by underneath. Mrs. Diner heard a noise coming from above. It was Hood, who landed right on the roof of her carriage. Ruth thought with relief that the carriage was pretty sturdy. He jumped off her and onto the ground, then took off running. The people accompanying the carriage stared at him in surprise. One of the riders shouted what it was and called for help from Sir Lisbon. Ruth heard someone telling him to stay still and felt a blade at his neck. He thought that man was pretty fast. Sir Lipson asked if he knew which carriage he had climbed onto. Ruth replied that he didn't know. He gave a polite bow and said he apologized, that he couldn't have imagined any noble would be traveling in it. Although there were unavoidable circumstances, he shouldn't have done it and sincerely apologizes for any trouble caused. From now on, he'll be careful so that they might forgive him just this once. A little surprised, Sir Lipson replied yes. Ruth thanked him again and ran off. One of the attendants laughed and commented on how sincerely he apologized, asking Lipson about it. Why did he raise his sword against the boy? He replied by asking if he really thought this was just an ordinary boy. Despite falling from such a height, he landed perfectly. You can't really call him just a simple child. The other person pointed out that Lipson himself hadn't participated in the hunt for mid-level monsters. This boy seems to have a promising future ahead of him. Maybe I should take this chance and make him my apprentice. Mrs. Denner watched their conversation closely. She realized that the boy seemed strong and smart. Lipson's companions said that since the lady thought the same, maybe they should bring him here and recruit him for their team. But under Lipson's stern gaze, he finally quieted down. Sir Lipson expressed his hope that Mrs. Diner hadn't been hurt in the collision. She said she was fine, but since they were already close to their destination and the weather was nice, she'd like to take a short walk. Sir Lipson replied that it was as the lady wished. And then they continued on foot. Ruth, who was watching them, thought that lady was truly an aristocrat, and that man with her is pretty capable. Either way, it's good that she just let it go. Ruth thought that luck hadn't been on her side lately, and that, in any case, she wouldn't run into them again. Mrs. Diner was sitting on the sofa, smiling sweetly. Sir Lipson and his companion were behind her. They were in the master's study, and the master himself and Ruth were sitting across from him. Ruth said she probably should go, but the master stopped her and told her she should stay and listen. Mrs. Denner asked if they were talking about the same boy. The master replied that, although he seemed small and unassuming, he was one of the greatest talents in Opian. Mrs. Denner said that, since he belongs to Opian, he must be an official mage. The master explained that, even though he had only recently become a 7th grade mage, he was the best among his peers. There must be many hidden talents in Opian. There are even rumors about the Dark Mage going around on the street. They say he's incredibly talented. Since you're here, would you like to meet the person these rumors are about? The master said with a sweet smile that he was sorry, but the Dark Mage was currently on a mission. Mrs. Diner said that if that was the case, there was nothing to be done. She realized she had gotten a bit sidetracked from the task at hand, and she told Rudu that they would meet again. The master and Ruth looked at her in confusion. She explained that he hadn't seen her, but she was the owner of the carriage he had fallen from. In response to the master's question, Ruth replied that it had just happened that way. Mrs. Diner said it might be fate. She told the master that he could fully trust that boy. He replied that he was grateful to Duchess Artyom for the trust she had placed in him. Mrs. Diner was a duchess. Ruth thought that, of course, she had guessed she was a noblewoman, but not a duchess. Duchess Artayan said it was time to get to work. Since she had already told Master Opinion, maybe he knows as well. The reason she came in person is because of her second son, who is now in Helios. The master said that, apparently, he wants to tell the Duchess about the second young gentleman. He confirmed that her second son was having difficulties at school. She gave instructions to the second attendant, Fran. She handed over a stock of documents and explained that they contained information about Helios, along with a list of students, as well as a report on the current situation. Ruth believed she had heard about Helios just today. The Duchess said that her son had only entered Helios a month ago and that she didn't know what had happened, but now they were calling him a monster there. The master was surprised. Who would dare treat the second young Master Artian like that? The Duchess replied that he wasn't the only noble present, and that, once admitted, any outside interference in the school's affairs was strictly forbidden. She added that he is a very sensitive child and that ever since he was little, his older brother took away all the love and attention. He grew up alone and withdrawn, and even she couldn't give him the attention he deserved. This child became so fragile. Unable to express the pain he was hiding, the Duchess said she didn't want him to suffer anymore. And more importantly, she can't allow a member of her family to be treated like that in that place. The Duchess said her task was very simple. Help him start living a peaceful school life in a place where they call him a monster. Protect him. After the Duchess left, Rude said he was waiting for an explanation. He explained that he was referring to this absurd and ridiculous situation. The teacher, with an innocent smile, said that everything was just as he had heard. The Duchess had submitted a request, and he would take care of fulfilling it. Rude said he must be joking. Besides, how could he even imagine it that way? The teacher replied that he couldn't say he was his dark mage. He added that there was nothing to worry about. Helios was an elite school, but all the students were still unawakened pupils. Ruth asked if he hadn't received a report from Ren about the failed mission and said she needed to investigate what had happened there. The teacher stated that he would handle this matter himself, that he should take care of it during this mission, and handed him the document. This was a letter regarding the admission of Ruth A. Christie to the Helios School of Magic. Ruth said this had to be a joke. The teacher tried to explain everything to him, but he just handed the letter back. Ruth stated that their relationship was over. "Thank you very much for everything. It was a pleasure working with them, but from now on, he was leaving Oppian." The master shouted that he had done so much for him, that he had fed him, given him something to drink, and had stayed up at night. How could he do this to him? Ruth replied by saying how could he do that without saying a word to her, that she would never agree to go to school. The teacher stated that this wasn't a school, but a mission. But Ruth replied that she didn't want to take on that mission. The teacher said that she didn't understand. All he wants is to educate her. Even if it's like this feeling is deeper than the ocean. Ruth felt like she no longer understood what was happening. Then Ren shouted at them and asked what they were doing there. The master asked if he could knock before coming in, since he was having an important conversation. Ren said he did knock on the door and ordered them to sit down and not humiliate them in front of the whole district. Ruth asked him if he really knew. Ren said she shouldn't take it so seriously, that it was better to treat it like a fun outing, that the students there would be like kids to her. Isn't it worth taking the opportunity to have a little break, experience school life, and make friends your own age? There's nothing scary about it. Ruth said she didn't need friends. The teacher said that if Ruth didn't want to deal with the matter, then so be it. The Duchess herself had traveled all the way to Oppian and had entrusted them with the mission. They'll simply tell her that they can't take on that mission, although, of course, he won't lose his head over it. But if that makes things easier for Rudu, then it's all good. Ren stepped in and said that was enough nonsense. Of course, it was the teacher's fault for having started all this without consulting him first. He'll go to school because he's officially enrolled there. This could take a long time, so the decision's up to him. Ren asked what he wanted. Rudd said that in the end, he just has to help the Duchess's second son. Ren and the teacher looked at him in disbelief. The teacher replied yes, and that it wouldn't be too difficult, and Ren declared that was great, that he expected nothing less from his opium star. Ruth asked if the school uniform was ready and if he should start packing, though he thought maybe he should refuse. The teacher explained that he had told the Duchess he was a 7th level mage, but the school didn't know he was an officially awakened mage. This means he can't be there. Blow. The teacher assured him that there wouldn't be anything dangerous there, but that he should be careful with the teachers, since after all, they were official mages. He also said that this mission would be like a vacation for the Dark Mage Blow. But at the same time, this will be Ruth's first mission for Christie. Ruth thought the teacher had a way with words, and Ren wondered what kind of clothes he should give her as a gift. Meanwhile, Ruth was reviewing the information and thinking about how she could help that boy. A photograph of a young man with a sinister look caught her attention. Ruth thought he looked pretty scary. She put the photograph on the table, and she asked if that man was the one behind the persecution of the Duke's second son. Ren and the teacher hesitated a bit before answering. Then, the teacher said that actually, this guy, Lidosis Dean Artian, the one people mock and call a monster, is the second young master Artian. Post office, in opinion. Ben asked the employee why he couldn't send the letter. He replied that Helios was very strict about accepting things from outside, so they couldn't accept letters without a certificate. The employee also said that if his sister was studying there, she should have a certificate and that he should ask his parents for it. Ben said that his mother wouldn't allow him to send letters and asked if they could send them themselves. The employee apologized and said that without a certificate, he couldn't help. Ruth suddenly appeared and announced that she had a certificate. She asked for the letters to be sent to Helios along with her luggage. Ben looked at her in surprise. Ruth assured him that she could deliver the letters. Helios School of Magic. The school day was beginning. Among the students, there was talk that that same guy would be arriving today. He was the only one who passed the entrance exam with honors, and the teachers made a big fuss about it at the time. This silver-haired girl thought irritably that it was way too noisy there. How interesting the next lesson would be. The blue-haired student was sleeping at his desk, and someone said that Varys was asleep again. A girl was showing her friends the jewelry she had bought when she was allowed to leave. A young man with long hair walked into the classroom. The conversations among the students stopped immediately. The long-haired student crossed the classroom and sat down in his seat. Everyone watched him in silence. Someone said in a low voice, "Monster." The silver-haired girl observed with satisfaction that silence had finally fallen. The long-haired student sat silently at his desk. La Dorses D. In Artan, Ruth asked, surprised. The best result on the entrance exams and a chronic illness. The teacher and Ren nodded affirmatively. Ruth groaned. They were serious. How could someone get a perfect score on a test they'd never seen before? And what kind of illness was that? The teacher prided himself on being a capable man and said that, in the end, everything had turned out this way. He said it had been about a month since the new students started their studies and that his invitation had also arrived a month ago. Ruth was supposed to go there back then, but the timing wasn't right, and he still didn't know it. So a plausible excuse was needed to buy some time, and it had to be something that the strict Helios would accept. A handsome boy, fragile yet brilliant. Doesn't that sound fun? Ruth realized he was being harassed, but he had nowhere to go. A voice calling him Student Christie snapped him out of his reverie. The teacher asked what he was thinking about and told him to follow, since classes had already started. Ruth thought that if the enrollment certificate had arrived a month ago, then the application must have been submitted even earlier. This means the teacher intended to send them to school even before the mission came up. So now, what exactly is he supposed to do here? Ruth thought that, as expected from a magic school, there were streams of mana everywhere. In any case, since it's come to this, we just need to finish the mission quickly and go back. The teacher told him that people of all ages and backgrounds come here, so that doesn't matter. Ruth asked, "So what is important here then?" Then, the teacher answered solemnly that the most important thing here is talent. First-year students usually feel joy when they enter the school, imagining what extraordinary mages they'll become. It's as if they've already become mages. However, this is nothing more than a misconception. Just getting into Helios doesn't mean they'll become official mages. In fact, many students are unable to overcome their own limits and fall into despair. The teacher asked what was going on with him. He's the first person to get a perfect score on the entrance exam. Ruth replied that if effort alone isn't enough, then he'll just have to drop out. The teacher laughed and commented that he has a sense of humor. Ruth thought that passing the exam with the highest score was actually harder than she had previously believed. The teacher said that Elio is always happy to accept talented students and congratulates him wholeheartedly. Helion School, specializing in magic. A place filled with people who have the talent to sense and use mana, with the goal of training them to become true mages who bear the emblem. Depending on their abilities, students are divided into the Advanced Jerry's class. Middle class, Treasure. The lowest class is Aiden. First-year students start in Idon and can move up to the next level through exams that are held once a year. The teacher introduced him as Ruth Akisti and said he was joining the class late due to health issues. He asked the students not to exclude him for arriving a bit late and to try to get along with him. Then he asked her to greet the others. Ruth told everyone that she was looking forward to working together. The students began to whisper, talking about him. Meanwhile, Ruth looked around the classroom to find the person who had brought him there. And finally he found it. Here he is, the second son of the Duchy of Artian, a monster who is mocked. Ladorsis Dean Artu. Ruth wondered why he was sitting there. The professor offered him a free seat. Ruth watched Ladorsis. He didn't seem weak or vulnerable, but at the same time he was being harassed and called a monster. He decided that he first needed to understand the situation. There was no need to rush. It was better, observe first. The student who was sitting in front turned around and greeted Rude. He called him a local genius and asked if he really passed the exam with an excellent score. And he also asked how old he was. Rude replied that he was 15 years old. The student said he knew Rude was younger than him and mentioned that he was 17. Then the man introduced himself and said his name was Diovares. He said there was no need for formalities and that he could just call him Dio. Ade was just a number. The teacher said he understood why Dio, who was ranked last, wanted to be friends with Rude Christie, but asked them to postpone the conversation until the break. Rude decided that the best thing he could do now was just sit quietly and observe. After class, the students surrounded him and started asking questions to get to know him better. Rude thought that if he didn't stand out, there wouldn't be any problem, but they turned out to be pretty curious. They kept pestering him with questions and didn't even fall behind while walking. Rude figured it was probably because it was his first day at school. That's why everyone was so outgoing. Diovares told everyone to step aside. He had been given an important mission to show the new kid around the school. Rude glanced over to where Ladorsus had been sitting and saw that he had disappeared somewhere. Rude thought it would be interesting to find out where he had gone. At that moment, Diovares called him friend and announced that it was time to set off, then took him to get familiar with the school. He said the school was really big, so at first he might get lost, but after a few days he'd get his bearings. He asked if he could just call him Rude, and he said yes. Dio said he was extremely nervous when he first arrived. It's really hard to get in here unless you're a noble. He thought happiness was just beginning, but in reality nothing changed. He was the last one in the test. Dio said that Rude is amazing. If he was the first to pass the exam with an A, it's actually the opposite. Rude said that Dio's amazing too. Out of all the students, he managed to make it to the end, which is impressive. Not just anyone can do that. Dio was left frozen in amazement. He asked Rude not to say things like that with such a serious face. This is where you'll be spending most of your time. This is the central library of Helios. It's huge, and there are tons of books here. As for the students in the Manosphere, they maintain a soundproofing spell so you can fully concentrate on your book. Rude thought that the cost of all this must be considerable. The library has 4 floors, but for now, only the first one is accessible to them, the lower class. Suddenly, someone called out to Dio, referring to him as the blue-haired, gloomy-faced guy. A student asked him if he was in Professor Hale's class. Dio replied yes, that was correct. This student wore the carry symbol on his sleeve. Rude thought he was probably from an advanced class. A student asked how the monster in their class was doing. Dio replied that it was fine. The student said that was a shame. Then he said they could get back to what they were doing and walked away. Dio said he felt like his heart was about to jump out of his chest. Rude asked him why he was so nervous, just because the guy was from the advanced class. Dio replied that apparently Rude still hadn't experienced a real hierarchical society. He said he would grant him sacred knowledge to help him survive the tough life in Helios. Rule number 1 is to never cross an advanced class student from Erasus. They are the chosen ones, possessing exceptional talent and skills, and are recognized by the school. There are fewer than 20 of them, but their abilities are comparable to those of 100 Adans, so their privileges are proportional to their capabilities. A single mistake and your peaceful life will end that day. They are the elite among the students. To ordinary people, they're like stars in the sky. Rude asked, "So what's the second rule then?" Dio whispered in his ear that the second rule was to be wary of a student named Cheville von Gedelio. He explained that this was the blonde man he had just seen. You have to be careful with him. It's best to avoid him if you see him. They're talented, of course, but they've got personality. Rude mockingly asked if the characters had to be unpleasant. Dio hissed at him and told him to shut up and take things more seriously. He needed to hear that for his own good. Cheville von Adelio is the heir to the respected Marquis Adelio, and because of his family, not even the teachers want to get involved with him. If you cross paths with him, he'll hunt you down to the end and your life will become a living hell. Rude said he'd be careful and asked why they called that guy a brat. Dio replied that he was a living example of what would happen if you messed with Adelio. Rude asked for more details, but he tried to avoid the topic and said there were still plenty of places left to visit. They visited the central fountain. We went to the magic item shop. We visited lots of other interesting places. After finishing their walk, Rude decided it had been more of an expedition than a field trip. Who would have thought it would take us all day? Rude thought that rascal sure knew a lot, even though he'd only been there a month. Finally, a school staff member arrived. They said his luggage had arrived on time, and she said that, for now, he could stay in a temporary room until they found him a roommate. Rude asked if this problem still hadn't been solved yet. The staff member explained that, according to the rules, 2 students were supposed to share a room, but at that moment, there weren't any available rooms for his class. Rude asked if there were any free rooms left in the school. The staff member was surprised and explained that he'd heard Ladorcity and Artian lived alone in a room. Ruth was standing in front of her room's door. She had a key in her hand and remembered the staff member's reaction to her request. She said she was putting him in that room alone only because he had asked her to, and that if he changed his mind, he could always come to her. Ruth thought it would be pretty hard to convince her. She decided it was time to meet the main target of the mission and knocked on the door. No one answered her, so she decided no one was there. She opened the door and went into the room. The room turned out to be quite large for 2 people. Ladorcus was lying on the bed covered with a blanket. Ruth was surprised that he was sleeping at that hour. She pulled the blanket aside and saw that Ladorcus was, in fact, sleeping peacefully. Ruth thought that, given the circumstances, he shouldn't be sleeping so soundly. She decided it was time to unpack her things and moved away from the bed. She didn't see that Ladorcus was staring at her intently. Night has fallen in Helios. The professor was walking down the hallway when suddenly he heard someone say that if they kept calling him that, there would be trouble. He needs time to avoid prying eyes in the tower. Then, Professor Hale's voice replied that he would certainly fulfill the contract, but that he needed a little more time. The teacher ran into Hale's room and asked him what had happened, but he calmly replied with what he meant. The professor said there was some kind of shadow here. He definitely saw a black shadow. Suddenly, he felt something strange and turned around, frightened. Professor Hale stated that he would do everything possible to fulfill the contract. Morning arrived in Helios. Ruth woke up in her bed. She thought she had slept for quite a while. As expected, Ladorcus was no longer in the room. His bed was perfectly made. When he managed to leave yesterday, no matter how much she tried to talk to him, he pretended to be asleep. Ruth thought that maybe it was too soon to live in the same room with him, since he was much more cautious than he seemed. When she looked out the window, she saw that the courtyard was already full of people. It seemed like everyone there had gotten up early. The students were chatting excitedly and talking about him, among other things. She heard that a new student who had gotten a perfect score on the entrance exam was now sharing a room with a brat. Besides, he wanted it himself. Ruth decided that if they were reacting so strongly to just being neighbors, the situation was much more serious than she thought. We'll have to take more active measures. Suddenly, she saw a group of students from the cadet class taking Ladorcus somewhere. At the same time, they were acting pretty aggressively. Other students saw what was happening, but no one dared to step in. Ruth also decided to just watch for now. Ladorcus was shoved so hard that he fell down. One of the treasurers asked him why he didn't understand what they were telling him. A spawn like him can't walk down the main hallway. He has to sneak around so he doesn't draw attention. Artian's family doesn't seem to care at all. And his older brother recently said he doesn't have a younger brother. Doesn't that mean they've all abandoned him? What a pathetic sight. One of the students said that, in any case, it was good that his family didn't care about him and stepped on his hand. Others tried to stop him, but he said he was just a brat. When else will they get the chance to do this to someone from a ducal family? The student invited his classmates to trample on him, but then a book fell right on his head. The blow was pretty hard and he fell, and his friends wondered where the book had come from. A voice came from the wall and said it was their book. It was Ruth. She politely asked them to return the book to her. Then Ruth jumped right on top of him. Ladorcus watched what was happening in surprise. Ruth landed on the second student, Clat, and apologized, saying she thought it was the floor. The third student yelled at her, asking what she was doing, but Ruth replied that it wasn't his place to ask. The student angrily swung his arm and tried to hit her, but Ruth easily intercepted his hand. She smiled and told the student that he had hit her first. Ladorsis watched in amazement as Ruth fought back. The student lost consciousness from the blow. As a result, 3 students from the treasure class were left lying in front of Ruth and Ladorsis. Ruth was surprised to realize she was weaker than she thought, since she hadn't hit that hard. Meanwhile, Ladorsis took advantage of the moment and escaped. Ruth watched the figure as it moved away. She tried to stop him by calling his name, but he told her not to come any closer. Ruth didn't stop him. Under the surprised gazes of 2 students passing by, Ladorsis kept running. The girl saw the Clat students lying on the ground and ran over to help them. By then, Ruth had already managed to hide. She thought about what Ladorsis had told her, not to come any closer. At the same time, she didn't notice that other students were looking at him strangely. Ruth concluded that Ladorsis reacted differently today than he did yesterday. She wondered where Ladorsis might have gone and if she should have followed him right away. But then Diovaro lunged at him and dragged him to a secluded spot. When they were alone, Dio asked if it was true that he lived in the same room as the brat. Ruth answered yes. Dio said, sounding discouraged, that he should have explained everything yesterday and that for now he needed to switch rooms. Ruth asked why. Dio replied that it was necessary for his peaceful life at school, but he didn't seem to understand the situation he was in. The brat Chebel was talking about is the young man from the Arshan family. Ruth said she realized that Chebel von Jadelia was behind everything. Then she asked if that justified what was happening to Ladorsis, who was being called a scoundrel and ignored by everyone. Ladorsis was hiding nearby at that moment and heard their entire conversation. Dio replied that it wasn't like that. Ruth said that he thought so too. Then she asked what Ladorsis thought about it. Dio looked at him confused. Ladorsis came out from behind the boxes. Ruth tried to talk to him. Dio asked how long he'd been standing there, but Ladorsis walked past in silence. He tried to leave, but tripped over some boxes and fell. Ruth wanted to call out to him, but Dio covered her mouth with his hand. She asked what he hoped to accomplish by stopping him. Either way, nothing's gonna change, and I might end up taking his place. Ladorsis was leading. Ruth grabbed him by the sleeve and called his name. She said maybe they should talk, but Ladorsis said he didn't need to. He yanked his sleeve out of Ruth's hand and walked away. Ruth couldn't understand what was wrong with him. Dio asked him what was going on with him, what he was trying to talk to him about, and why. He replied that they lived in the same room and asked why they called him a brat. What could have happened in a month for everyone to start calling him that? When other students saw him, they wondered why he was still studying there. They would have left a long time ago. They said he was creepy and called him a monster. Little Ladorsis cried bitterly. There was a girl lying at his feet. She was dead. There was an older boy standing nearby. He told Ladorsis that he was the one responsible for her death. Those terrible memories came back to Ladorsis' mind. Dio said thoughtfully that this was the reason why everyone called the young master Artian a brat. He himself doesn't now. Rude nodded and tried to leave, but Dio stopped him. He said it all started with Chubble. At first, everything was fine, but after that incident, everyone started calling him a brat. Ruth asked what had happened. One day, not long after entering Helios, many Edens gathered in the library. According to the story, that day the young master Artian transformed into a terrible monster right there. They said he had 3 eyes, his whole body was covered in hair, and his arms were split into 8 parts. Rude asked what nonsense he was talking about, but Dio replied that he hadn't been there and was just repeating rumors. Ruth thought it was ridiculous. How could he possibly turn into a monster? In any case, the library was closed for several days, so something really did happen there. Dio said that Rudu needed to change rooms quickly. The rumors about it had already spread throughout Eden and would soon reach the heretics. Ruth said that, indeed, everyone's reactions today were different from yesterday. He asked Dio if he would also avoid him if he didn't change rooms. He looked at him in surprise. Ruth said he wouldn't do that he's not one of those people. Dio had no choice but to accept. The two of them walked through the school building under the watchful eyes of those around them. Ruth said it seemed like he was still the center of attention, to which Dio replied seriously that he didn't want to be the center of attention. He asked Ruth what he was planning, since he had no intention of going against the Kriyas. After a brief pause, he answered that, of course not. Dio also asked why he was trying so hard to help the young teacher Artian. Ruth replied that it wasn't exactly help, but he thought to himself that, above all, it was a task. When they entered the classroom, Lycurdasis was already sitting in his seat. As always, he stared at the desk in silence. Ruth stated that even if nothing changes, even if he does nothing, it would be the same as agreeing with this injustice. He remembered that the Duchess had told him he was a lonely child, and for the sake of this child, who is called a child and who suffers, she is willing to do anything. Upon entering the classroom, Ruth turned to Dia. He said that they were in the same situation as him. Lighter as DNR Chan. Even though status is considered unimportant in Helios, the Artian family is not something to be taken lightly. Ruth said she wanted to change seats and asked for the seat next to Lighterus to be left open. The students looked at each other in confusion. What was she doing? Including the silver-haired girl. If he himself had mentioned his family, he wouldn't be in this situation. So why isn't he doing anything? Ruth thought that this was exactly what she would have to deal with. Now, the three of them were sitting side by side, Lidorsis, Ruth, and Dio. According to the ancient books left by the kings of the past, mages are God's lions, and they are also described as great saviors who purify corrupted lands and defeat monsters. Nowadays, such fame is no longer entirely appropriate, since there are unworthy and mediocre mages, those who obtain their qualifications illegally and just wander around. But even so, you can't say they're not saviors. Today, only they can stand up to the monsters. During class, the students watched the trio sitting nearby with curiosity. Among them was a girl with green hair. Once class was over, the students kept looking at them with curiosity, but no one approached them. Suddenly, Ruth spoke loudly to Lidorsis. She didn't react at all and remained silent. Ruth shouted out loud to the whole class again, "Hey, Lidorsis!" Suddenly, Dio told her he was hungry and suggested they have lunch together. They left. Lidorsis stayed seated in the classroom. During lunch, Dosi suggested to Rudu that he reconsidered. He said that, anyway, neither of them would change anything. Besides, if the person doesn't care about anything, why should they interfere? They don't care whether they're around or not. Ruth replied that she didn't believe that. The book Literasis was supposedly reading was open upside down. In fact, she was very aware of their presence. Dio said sadly that the friends he used to joke and laugh with now don't even look him in the face. Ruth agreed that it was true. She said that if two people find it hard to change something, then they just need to find more people to join them. A group of treasures walked into the dine hall. Ruth stated that, in any case, it was already too late to turn back. The treasures stopped in front of them. Their leader asked if she was Ruth Christie. Ruth looked him in the eye and replied, "Yes, so what?" One of the treasures, who had a bandage on his nose, was outraged by how insolently she was behaving. The leer, whose name was Manon, said he hoped Ruth would come with him. He agreed, and they went to the park. Manon told the others they could leave. Their companions left, and Manon was left alone with Ruth and Dio. Ruth found her face familiar. Dio whispered to her that the last time, this treasure was in Adelio's possession. Klatt said he knew why he had brought him there. Ruth replied that she didn't now. He was the one who brought him here. So why is he asking about that? Manon said she had heard he was running late. It must be true since he's so fearless. Then she firmly stated that Ruth would do well to stay away from that bastard monster. Ruth was surprised. A monster? She doesn't quite understand what she means. Is there a monster in Helios? Manon said she doesn't like word games. Is it just compassion, or does she actually enjoy playing along with such a scoundrel? She'd better stop doing that. There's a reason behind every outcome. She should stop getting involved in things she doesn't understand and focus on her own business. If she stays close to him, she'll lose everything and gain nothing. Ruth asked if she had given her any advice. Manon replied that it wasn't advice. He's warning her. Ruth and Dio were sitting in the school courtyard. Ruth said that meant it was a warning. Dio said that since it had come to the point of telling her this, it was best to keep things simple. Ruth asked, exactly what? Dio told her to forget it and asked what she was going to do next. First of all, they need more allies, even though that won't be easy. Ruth said we could think about this later, but for now, we needed to gather information and find out what really happened. Dio asked how she was going to find out. Ruth replied that the easiest way would be to just ask directly. First, you need to have a normal conversation with Lydorsis. And then we have to think about what to do next. Overthrow Chubble or turn the school upside down. Ruth looked inside the storage room where Lydorsis used to hide, but there was no one there. Where had she gone? Meanwhile, Lydorsis was in the teacher's office. She asked her if she really didn't have any problems with her academic life. Lydorsis replied that she didn't have any problems. The teacher said she knew Diner and that if anything was worrying her, she could tell her without hesitation. She added that if he doesn't want to help himself, then the school can't do anything either. But Lydorsis remained silent. There were a lot of students in the school building. Ruth stopped one of them and kindly asked if he had seen Lydorsis, but he replied that he didn't know and quickly ran off. The students looked at Ruth strangely, wondering why he was looking for the offspring and advising each other not to look him in the eye. Ruth thought it was pretty difficult to strike up a conversation with them. Could he really be that unpleasant to them? Suddenly, a silver-haired girl told him that if he was looking for the offspring, it seemed like he had gone to the west storeroom. She added that he had a magic box in his hand, so she was probably right. Ruth thanked the girl for this information. Her friends immediately rushed over to the girl, whose name was Yell. They asked her why she was talking to someone like him. Of course, they'll protect her if anything happens, but she needs to be careful. Ruth turned toward Yell and her friends. She said she wasn't looking for the sprouts, but for Lydorsis. Then she turned around and left, leaving the girl confused. Ruth picked a spot where she could see Lydorsis if she really went to the Western warehouse. She was gone for a long time, and Ruth thought she might have already passed away. Finally, she saw Lydorsis, who was carrying a box of stones. She wanted to shout to her, but thought that calling out from here wasn't exactly appropriate. She remembered Manon's warning. However, after thinking it over, she decided to ignore the threats and shouted Lydorsis' name at the top of her lungs across the whole yard, waving her hand. She yelled for her to wait and said she'd be there soon, but Lydorsis pretended not to hear her and ran off. Ruth thought the rascal was running away again. She remembered how she had left last time. Ruth realized she would avoid her until the very end. With the other students staring in surprise, she jumped down to the ground and ran after Lydorsis. The students watched what was happening in astonishment. One of the students asked the green-haired girl, whose name was Rin, did she see that guy jump from such a height? Ruth kept chasing after Lydorsis. The students were asking each other what was going on, why they were running. Ruth thought that, without realizing it, she had become a spectacle for them. That rascal ran really fast and she couldn't catch up to him. Ruth sped up and almost grabbed Lydorsis by the clothes, but suddenly he started pulling stones out of the box and charging them with magic. And he threw them back in her direction. Ruth was surprised to discover that he could use magic. One of the stones hit her right on the forehead. Lydorsis turned around and apologized for it. Ruth was outraged. If he felt sorry, he should just stop running. Why had they started this pointless chase in the first place? Lydorsis replied that it happened because he was being chased. Ruth shot back that he was the one who started running away first. Lydorsis said he ran because he called out to him. He lowered his gaze. There was Cheval von Gedelio with a group of clats. Cheval looked up and saw Lydorsis standing there. Ruth said he shouldn't run away and suggested they just talk normally. Lydorsis suddenly shouted at him not to come any closer. Ruth looked at him in surprise. Lydorsis added that he should just stay away from him. Ruth picked up the fallen stone and threw it at Lydorsis' head. He grabbed the bruised spot in astonishment. Ruth came closer and grabbed him by the neck. He asked what he would do if he found himself this close. Ruth added that he wasn't going to do anything to him, he just wanted to talk to him. Suddenly, Shovel appeared next to him, balancing on the railing, and asked again, "Talk? With this brat?" He put his foot on LaDorsey's back. He asked Ruth what he wanted to talk to him about. What could a guy from Eden possibly want to talk about with this creature? Ruth made an almost imperceptible movement and Shovel fell off the railing. Lidorsis was horrified and Ruth watched him impassively. He said the guy had a terrible habit, but he landed pretty well. Ruth suggested that Lidorsis leave and go somewhere quiet. Then a hand landed on Rudu's head. It was an angry Adelio. He asked Ruth in a threatening tone if he was tired of living. He calmly replied that he wanted to live and politely asked him to take his hands off him. Chevelle asked how he dared to speak so insolently without knowing who he was. Ruth replied that of course he knew who Shovel Vaughn was. He asked Leaderess what happened next. Ruth said, "Isn't he the same great and supreme Aries?" intercepting his hand. Shovel smiled smugly, but suddenly gasped when Ruth squeezed his hand. He shouted, "Where did this arrogant idiot come from?" Shovel yelled at the girl standing among the treasures, "Anna!" She threw him a magic stone. Shovel, cunningly, caught him off guard and told him he wasn't magnanimous enough to tolerate his insolent behavior. As he put the chain with the magic stone around his neck, he said he should take this opportunity to find out. What happens if you act rudely toward Karis? Rude thought it was a high-level magic stone. Was he really trying to use magic on her? Shovel declared that it was already too late to have regrets. He had to carefully observe the magic of the future great mage. Ruth asked Ladorsis what he was going to do now. He replied that he needed to call the professor. Ruth agreed and told him to go, but Ladorsis said it would be better if he left instead. Shovel was outraged. What were they whispering about? Did they not understand the situation they were in? And he began to recite the spell. Ruth and Ladorsis watched him closely. Ruth thought it was a magic spell. He didn't want things to get out of hand, so it was better to run away. Ladorsis said he had warned him not to come closer and ordered him to leave. He said he would take care of everything himself. Ruth looked at him in surprise. What the hell does this bastard think he's going to do on his own? Shovel let out a chuckle and said how touching it was. It had been a long time since he'd seen a mutter like that in front of him. He only lost his mind because a rookie started paying attention to him. Ladorsis replied that that wasn't the problem, that he simply had nothing to do with it. Shovel yelled at him to shut up and put his hand on his face. He said this is the endless nightmare he wants. He'll send him to hell. He said, for example, Ladorsis is beautiful. A little blonde-haired girl was walking through the meadow. She had a flower in her hands. Blood appeared on the girl's face and clothes. She stopped in front of Ladorsis. Suddenly, a monster appeared behind the girl. Horror was reflected in Ladorsis' voice as she said, "Please, no." But Shovel, with an impassive face, kept influencing her. Ruth knocked Shovel down with an elbow strike. She leaned over Ladorsis, who had lost consciousness. Shovel screamed. He was out of his mind. How dare she interfere? Ruth asked what he was doing with Ladorsis. Shovel said that this monster seemed to have forgotten what he was guilty of and that he was simply reminding him. A monster like him, who doesn't know his place, must be punished. Shovel said that he didn't seem to know his place either, and therefore he should be punished as well. Shovel asked him if he had any memories he didn't want to remember or any fears he didn't want to relive. He added that, in any case, he could show them to him clearly and distinctly. Rude thought he was using illusion magic. So it became clear who was behind the story of how Ladorsis turned into a monster in the library. He wondered if he should take care of the matter himself. A threatening shout rang out. "What do you think you're doing?" Shovel Von Jadelio, it was Professor Khan who came running. Shovel told Rudu he could consider himself lucky. Professor Khan leaned over Rudd and Ladorsis, who were lying nearby, showing no signs of consciousness, and asked them if they were in pain. He sternly asked Shovel if he understood what he had done to those Eden students. Rude kept pretending to be unconscious and thought that the time hadn't come yet. But what happened between those two? A group of curious students tried to find out what was going on in Professor Hale's office. Rudd was sitting there, Professor Hale said that yesterday he heard him jump from a high balcony at the school. Is that true? Rudd replied that it wasn't. The professor asked what was going on when he was running around campus with Mr. Artine like a madman. Rudd replied that he hadn't done that either. Hale said that he also immediately thought it wasn't true. He added that he started his studies late because of an illness, so of course he couldn't have managed something like that. Rudd thought, embarrassed, that he had completely forgotten about the illness. And when the professor asked him if he was right, Rudd nodded right away. Hale advised him to be careful, saying it would be foolish to return to school after recovering, only to get sick again. Also, if he runs into Urias in the wrong way while he's eating, it will affect his entire school life. Red walked down the hallway and thought that, in the end, once again, he wouldn't be able to have a normal conversation with Ladorsis. Then Diovaris literally crashed into him. He asked what had happened, if it was true that he had gotten into a fight with Cheval. Rudd said that yes, they had met. Dio whispered that a strange rumor was spreading around the school that he was defeated by Cheval while he was enthusiastically playing with Lord Artian. Dio asked if he was okay, and if he hadn't gotten hurt anywhere. Rude replied that he was fine, but Ladorsis wasn't. Dio was horrified. He died. Red said he's alive. Why are you burying a person alive? He added that we could talk about this later, but for now, we had to go. Dio asked where to, and Rudd replied that he was going to Ladorsis. They searched almost the entire school, but couldn't find him anywhere. Rudd decided to check the storage room again. Duo asked if it wouldn't be better to wait for him to pass. During the second inspection of the storage room, they saw Lyda Cersis hiding behind some boxes. Dio was surprised. He really was there. They approached him, asking what he was doing there. Ladorsis didn't react to their approach. Rudd suggested they talk while they still had the chance. He asked Ladorsis if he wanted some candy. Rudd sat down next to him and told him to forget about the rumors that he was turning into a monster. He also asked why Cheval von Gedelio called him a monster. Ladorsis said it was none of his business. What people say about him has nothing to do with him, so just leave him alone. Ladorsis yelled at Rudd to stop worrying about him, to stay away, and to stop paying attention to him. Rudd looked at him in surprise. Rudd asked him if he was just going to let them keep calling him a monster and simply live there. Ladorsis replied that he was. After all, he's still a real monster. Rudd nodded and held out his closed hand to Ladorsis. He lifted the candy in his hand in surprise. Rudd said there was nothing he could do, that if he didn't want to talk about it, he'd have to ask Cheval von Gedelio, because he needs to know why he calls him a monster, just out of curiosity, so it's none of his business. His name is Rudd Christie. He started school a month late due to an illness, and it said he's had poor health since childhood. Chevrolet commented that for a man with poor health, he seems pretty lively. Anna went on to report, he lives in the same room as that monster, and the student he talks to, Diovaris, is in the same class. She added that he was the first person to get a perfect score on the entrance exams. Cheval asked, is that why he acts like he's the boss around here? He's showing off just because he passed a test. Anna asked what they would do next. Cheval said that, of course, they needed to make sure he couldn't get up, and threw a magic stone onto the table. Thick black smoke was coming out of the stone. Soon, the smoke stopped from now. A black cloud drifted over the school grounds. Little by little, it turned into an ominous black shadow that soon disappeared. However, the person on the balcony noticed something strange flying by. It was Lady Tessiana. She wondered what it was, but was distracted by the voice of a little girl calling her Tessie. The man sitting at the table with the girl said that the princess shouldn't play with her food. She said that Roma had asked her not to call her princess. He replied that in that case, she shouldn't call Lady Tessiana Tessie either. Rom reminded her that she wasn't Tessie there, and neither was Professor Rowell. Night fell over Helios. The teacher asked how Rudd was doing at school and if he had made any friends yet. Rudd sat on the roof and communicated with the teacher using a magic stone. He replied that it didn't matter and said that Ladorsis didn't need any particular help and asked them not to pay attention to him. If Ladorsis doesn't want this, then there's nothing he can do either. Maybe it would be better to just end the mission. The master replied that he hadn't asked for help under any circumstances, but that he didn't need it at all. Rudd replied that he didn't mount. Apparently, he had his own reasons that they didn't know about. The kids here are really strange. They act like they're hypnotized, calling him a monster, avoiding him, ignoring him. It seems like this whole situation was orchestrated by Shevel Vangedelio from the previous class. The master asked again. Adelio and Ruth asked if he knew him. The master replied that he definitely knew Adeli. It's an old noble family that has produced powerful mages for a long time. The head of the family, Marquis Adelio, is at the very center of imperial nobility and leads an active and brilliant life. Marquis Adelio and Duke Archian are known for their rivalry, maybe because of a conflict between their families. Ruth said that it wasn't really a dispute, but rather that Ladorsis was actually suffering one-sidedly. The master suggested that maybe Ladorsis had done something wrong. Maybe he took the girl or Sheba lost something valuable because of him. He said that, in any case, he would try to find out more about these two families. He also said that Rudu shouldn't take everything too seriously. The task was important, but he should enjoy his school life. For example, make friends or try to befriend someone. But Ruth had already broken the magical connection. She decided that first she needed to observe a little more. The house stood by the sea, right on the edge of a high, rocky cliff. Suddenly, a hand grabbed onto the parapet that surrounded the house on the seaside. Shortly after, a rather strange-looking young man appeared. He explained why Mrs. Ruby Monter chose that particular place as her home. Apparently, not only does he lack the sense of style needed to fit in here, but he also needs to control his bad temper. He put his hand on the door and suddenly found himself inside the room. He greeted Mrs. Ruby and told her that Elzeville had arrived. However, in the room there was only a huge fish. Elzeville sighed in relief. It seems she wasn't there. The huge fish informed her that Mrs. Ruby Monter had stepped out for a moment. Elzeville said that the human world had turned out to be much more interesting than she thought. The fish asked her if she had swum across the sea and told her to move away because she smelled like sea fish. Elzeville was outraged. If anyone there smelled like sea fish, it was him. She asked why he was in that state, since Ruby had told him to get used to his human form, and he replied that he felt suffocated. Elzeville said it was no wonder he felt overwhelmed, since he was locked up, and advised him to find something fun to do. The fish replied that, unlike him, he hadn't come here on vacation. Elzeville smiled mischievously and suddenly grabbed the fish by the tail. She said that, as a teammate, she couldn't ignore his complaints and dragged the fish to the window. And with a shout of Flyka, she threw him off the cliff. The fish fell to the bottom of the sea. Elzeville asked him if he felt better. The fish emerged from the sea, now in human form. A rather menacing-looking man said that his vile and rude character hadn't changed, not even here. Elzeville said he was still as boring and bland as ever. She called her companion Gamut and told him that here, people like him are called fish. A young woman with horns was watching him. Ruby Monter asked what they were doing there when she told them to sit quietly. She examined the letter, which stated that the infiltration of the Helios Academy of Magic had been a success, and the situation had calmed down. In any case, everything's going according to plan. Dawn is broken at the Helios Special School Magic. Professor Khan called out loudly for Professor Lowell, but she didn't answer. But then he saw Professor Hale. She approached him and asked if he had seen Professor Lowell. Professor Hale replied that he hadn't seen her today. He went about his business. Professor Khan asked if this was the same teleporter that would be used in the upcoming training in Eden. She said it looked pretty complicated and asked if it was his work, to which he replied yes. Professor Khan stated that she had heard the tower would be used this time, and that the practice would take place in that training room. If teleportation works like this, it will definitely be something amazing. Hale replied that this was the first practical training session of the year, and it needed to be carried out properly, with no incidents or accidents. Professor Khan said that, as expected from the master of teleportation, Professor Hale, Theo Vero placed a blue notebook on the table. Ruth asked what it was. Theo said it was valuable information he had gathered with all his effort. He added that it hadn't been an easy journey. All the boys avoided him, and when he tried to talk to them, they just ignored him. Ruth clarified that everyone on this list has abilities that can counter Shibla. Dio replied that it wasn't exactly like that he simply chose the nobles and those who showed excellent results. Ruth looked past him with skepticism. Dio was indignant and said he did everything he could to find out everything. A girl with green hair, Rin, was closely watching their conversation. Even her friend noticed it. Dio said that the others on the list might not be very important, but these two would definitely be useful. First of all, she is Uternin Maria Cancio, the only representative of the imperial family in Helios. At school, they call her Princess, and with the school's permission, she's always accompanied by a bodyguard from the Imperial Guard. Even the teachers are afraid to contradict her. If she becomes an ally of Prince Artanian, then Shebel will be nothing. Dio asked if anyone had overheard him by chance. Ruth replied that no one had, even though everyone around them could hear them perfectly well. There were rumors that the two of them were up to something, and ever since the rude Christie showed up, they hadn't had a single peaceful day. They already belonged to the same category as the monster, and now that these two are involved, they'll definitely get dragged in and suffer for nothing. The green-haired girl's friend was outraged. If they had treated the monster normally, they would have been the first to flatter her. She expressed her indignation to Rin, but Rin stayed silent. Ruth asked who the second one was then. Dia replied that the second is Lapis Yuan Nudley, the only son of Duke Nudley. He's influential even within the school walls. Unlike Lydor's, he's the sole heir. Duke Nudley and Chevley entered Helios at the same time. They had a bad relationship and now they just ignore each other. Ruth said that if he didn't like Shovel, it would be easier to get close to him. Dio agreed, but said there was a small problem. Since he joined Helios, he still hasn't been able to rise in rank in Eden. Dio explained that it was most likely due to a lack of skill. In theoretical subjects, he's always at the top, but when it comes to the practical application of magic, he lacks skills. Even though he doesn't have a talent for magic, he's popular for being the Duke's heir, and he hates Shovel, which could be useful. Dio said he wanted to find someone normal among those studying at Harrah's, but that it was impossible to get close to them. He stated that in any case, for now it's just these two. Suddenly, two students from the treasury entered their classroom. They asked to get everyone's attention. The students were surprised that Treasure was there. The students from the treasury announced that they had come to deliver a message from Professor Ubinos, who was supposed to teach their next class. Instead of the scheduled class, preparations would be made for the upcoming practical training. Therefore, the order was given for everyone to move to the East Lecture Hall. Ruth thought she wasn't very confident about the practical training. She realized that Lydorsis wasn't in his seat. Where did that guy go? Meanwhile, Ladorsis was sitting with his back against the wall in a narrow hallway. He had just been splashed with water. One of the treasures claims that the image of a wet mouse was very appealing to the monster prince. He added that they wanted to remind him that having a couple of idiots on the side doesn't change his stance. Manon showed up and ordered them to stop. She said that today's goal isn't to make fun of this monster, that's clear. Manon smiled and thought that since the stage was already set, it was time to bring the monster there, and she whispered something in my ear. Manon smiled and thought that since the stage was already set, it was time to bring the monster there. Meanwhile, Ruth continued her search for Ladorsis. Dio told her that they had already done everything they could and suggested they stop searching, not in the dormitory nor in the storage room. Prince Artian wasn't anywhere else, and that's why they were already late for class. Ruth asked, where could he be? He was definitely in class this morning. Theo figured he was probably sleeping soundly and resting somewhere. He said he needed to go to the main auditorium, that if he got penalized for being late, he was done for, that every point mattered to him. Ruth agreed to stop searching and go to class, but she had a bad feeling about it. The students gathered in a large auditorium, but the professor wasn't there. Only the Kladovzi remained on stage. They were whispering about what was going on. Where was the professor? Shouldn't there be class right now? And why are there Claude students here? Manon stepped forward and asked if all the students from Professor Hale's group were present. After receiving an affirmative answer, she said that since all the main participants had gathered, they could begin. The classroom was empty. Professor Ubinos looked around the empty room in surprise. He wondered where everyone had gone. Dio commented on how important this lecture is since they closed all the doors, which is pretty suspicious. Ruth thought the strangest thing was that she knew that secret entrance. Dio led them to a small door and told them it looked like they'd have to crawl. Manon spoke with the students from Eden. She showed them the manosphere and said that until apprentices become official mages, they can't use magic without a manosphere or stone. So the first thing they're taught is how to activate the mana inside the sphere. The manifestation of mana is the most basic and important thing, so today they'll have a special lesson as part of their training. Manon said the lesson was being given to see how they could activate mana. One of the students asked if the teacher was aware of this. Manon remained silent. Two Kladovtsi approached the student who asked the question and, under the frightened gazes of the other students, took him out of the hallway. Man asked if anyone else wanted to say something. The student stayed silent. Manon said that in that case, she would first explain something about the manospheres they were going to use. This sphere was created for testing purposes and should not be used for anything other than demonstrating magic. If you manifest mana in the sphere, it'll change color depending on your abilities. The better someone uses the mana in the sphere, the brighter the light will be and the more powerful the force it contains. However, it's possible that you'll only see minor color changes. You will be judged by the power that lies within the sphere, for which you will perform target practice. At her signal, two Claudes set up a target to which Lydorsis was chained. This target has a special arrangement. It can't inflict damage unless it's powered by mana. Therefore, you must do the following. Manifest mana into spheres and throw them at the target. Manon said that was all they would do in this lesson. The students whispered in surprise. She wants them to throw manospheres at her. Manon said that, of course, there was nothing funny about throwing spheres for no reason. So whoever hits her on the head gets extra points. The treasures spilled manospheres from the boxes that rolled to the students' feet. Manon asked who wanted to go first. She looked around and her expression changed. Manon said indignantly that he wasn't there. She grabbed her assistant and asked why he wasn't there. Theo Varus peeked out from behind his cover and watched what was happening. Rudd, who was standing behind, asked if class had already started. Theo hissed at him to come back immediately. He said something strange was going on and that they needed to call the teacher. Manon frowned in irritation. One of the treasures asked her what they should do next, since they had gone too far. Manon replied that they should keep following the plan. She thought pessimistically that she had managed all this without Chevelle knowing, but things hadn't gone as planned. And he thoughtfully watched the manosphere he held in his hand. Clad asked if anyone had the guts to go first. If not, he would have to choose himself. He pointed at the girl who had her hands pressed against her chest. Clad told her to go first and handed her the sphere. The girl looked at him fearfully and whispered that she couldn't. Then Clad asked if maybe she wanted to become a target herself. The girl turned to her friends for help, but they just looked away in silence. The girl took the manosphere in her hand and focused. The sphere she was holding glowed faintly. Clade said that, as expected, the color didn't change much. He stated that the next step is the most important. Since she's going first, he'll give her extra points if she manages to hit the monster. The girl gathered her strength and threw the manosphere. However, the sphere didn't even make it to the stage and fell to the ground. Clyde declared that she was disqualified. He thought things weren't going as they should and that the situation needed to be corrected. He shouted at his partner to set an example. He activated the manosphere and threw it at the target. He hit Ladorsis right on the hat. The students were horrified. Cloud said, "Excellent. You all saw how it's done." He asked who was ready to go next. Dio, who was watching the scene from behind cover, whispered, "Damn bastards." He turned to Rudd and told him to quickly bring the teachers, but Rudd had already disappeared somewhere. Suddenly, a hand was raised among the crowd of students. Clad looked in surprise at the one who had raised his hand. It was Rudd. He said he wanted to be next. His sudden statement surprised everyone. Manon thought that the rude Christie had finally shown up. Jael also couldn't understand what that guy was trying to do. The treasure on the stage said, "Excellent," and suggested he give it a try. Rudd took the manosphere and got ready. Claude said that if he could hit the monster, then he didn't finish speaking, and his gaze froze in surprise. The sphere thrown by Rudd made a huge hole on the target. All the treasures, including Manon, were stunned. Jael was also surprised. Dio's eyes widened. He couldn't understand what Rude was doing. Ladorsis glanced at the hole that had appeared in the target next to his head. Rudd said with disappointment that he had missed. Manon whispered that that couldn't be possible. Ladorsis felt the chains binding him loosen after the hit. Rudd picked up another manosphere. He said he was really sorry for missing and asked if he could try again. He started to awaken the sphere and declared that this time he would definitely hit the target. The manosphere he was holding in his hand glowed brightly and suddenly cracked. Before the astonished eyes of the spectators, it shattered. Rudd said it must have been defective, so he grabbed another one. The treasurer in charge of the activity tried to stop him, but Rudd ignored him and turned to Ladorsis. Rudd told him he was serious, and that if he didn't want to get hit, he'd better get out of the way. With those words, he threw the spear. The students watched what was happening in amazement. Ladorsis lunged and fell off the target. The manosphere hit Clouda square in the forehead. Rudd apologized. The rest of the treasurers watched their fallen companion in silence. Rudd asked why he was just standing there, saying how awkward it was. Dio, watching from behind cover, thought it was no coincidence that he had immediately sensed this wasn't just some ordinary guy. The students were frozen in surprise. And he whispered, "Rude Christie? Who is he?" Manon couldn't believe her eyes. The sphere went straight through the target. Not even he could leave a scratch on it. On top of that, the color of his sphere was similar to that of a snake. How could Eden manifest such a color? Man was confused. Maybe it was some kind of trick, though you couldn't really call it a trick. Who is this guy? Rubbing his shoulder, Rudd said that everything was going wrong. The target is broken. The target's no longer in the center. How about we pick a new target? The students were frozen when they heard the new target. Red explained that this could be the case, for example. Who orchestrated this unpleasant performance? Or one of his loyal henchmen? Or how about the person who created this special class becomes the target of the training? Rudd said that would be interesting, right? Manon was outraged. That brat was talking about a new target. She claimed that she would then personally choose the target. And that target will be Rudd Christie. Manon shouted for everyone to grab that brat. Theo, who was watching from behind cover, declared that he couldn't just stand by and had to help him. He lunged forward, but someone grabbed him by the collar of his shirt. It was Professor Rowell. Dio was really happy to see Professor Rowell and tried to explain the situation to her, but she told him to be quiet. He was surprised and asked her what she was going to do. She replied that she was watching. Dio got upset and tried to say something, but she covered his mouth with her hand. Professor Rowell was closely watching everything that was happening in the classroom. Meanwhile, Ruth threw a ball at one of the treasures and hit him right in the face. He fell and didn't move again. The rest of the treasures rushed at him to stop him and keep him from picking up the ball. They even managed to capture him. But Ruth hit one of the treasures holding him and kicked the other one away. He looked at the third treasure who was holding him, and the treasure backed away, scared. Ruth said she was sorry, but she was in a bad mood today. So please, don't touch him as you please. The students from Eden were shocked by what was happening. Manon asked her assistant if she still had the ball. She said there were a lot of them lying on the ground. Manon said she didn't need an experimental sphere, but a real one she could use. But the student replied that they only had experimental spheres. Manon grabbed the experimental sphere. She thought that Ruth de Christie was definitely not your average person. Manon addressed everyone present and declared that anyone who managed to hit the rude Christie would receive a reward. At the same time, she activated her sphere and threw it at Ruth. Ruth calmly watched the sphere flying toward him, But then, Ladorsis lunged at him and shielded him from the hit with his own body. Ruth was surprised that this indifferent guy reacted that way. He asked him why he had taken the hit himself. Manon shouted furiously, calling him a monster. She asked those around her why they were just standing there like idiots and ordered them to throw spheres at the two of them. Professor Rowell continued to calmly watch what was happening. Ruth asked Ladorsis how he was, if all his bones were still intact. The remaining clots raised their spheres and got ready to throw them at Ruth and Ladorsis. Ruth told Ladorsis that she just wanted to know, just in case, if he had any weird hobbies or if he simply liked being bullied. He indignantly replied that he didn't. Ruth said that reassured her and then asked why he had covered for her then. Since he asked her to stop worrying about herself, he shouldn't care if he gets hit or not. It'll be fair for both of them. Ladorsis insisted that it was all his fault and that he couldn't let anyone suffer because of him. At that moment, one of the treasures threw a sphere at them. Ruth pushed Ladorsis aside and caught the sphere with her hand. She asked Ladorsis what he was talking about. It wasn't his fault. Clat was frozen in shock when he saw that she had caught the sphere. Ruth added that the thing is, she just hates that kind of person. Some shouted, "Throw spheres at her." But then the sphere thrown by Ruth knocked down his companion. Ruth dodged the sphere flying toward him and started counting the enemies he had taken down. This was the first one. She took down Treasure, who had been asking for spheres to be thrown at her. And I thought it was the second one. Another Treasure shouted, outraged by what that brat was doing. Third force. Ruth kept counting. She wondered how many were left and also where Ladorsis might be now. Meanwhile, Ladorsis stood in front of the crowd of Edens and faced the spheres flying toward him. Ruth wondered what that idiot was up to. The other students looked at him, confused. Suddenly, Rin shouted that she was bleeding. She ran over to him and started untying his hands. She whispered, barely audibly, "I'm sorry." Ladorsis looked at her in confusion. Meanwhile, Ruth found another treasure. She wondered if it was day 11 or 12. Ruth said it seemed like those were the only ones left. She looked toward the stage where Manon was standing with two henchmen. They looked at him and feverishly thought about what to do now. Ruth slowly approached them. Manon was confused about what he was. Almost all the other treasures had been defeated. Manon even thought that maybe he was sleeping now. Ruth got almost all the way to the stage. He smiled sweetly and asked, "Shall we continue?" Rin approached Ladorsis and said again, "I'm sorry," trying to talk to him, but someone stopped her. It was her friend who tried to pull her away from Ladorsis. Rin looked at her. "And also about my other classmates." She asked them how much longer they were going to keep this up. "Do you really think Ladorsis is a monster?" Rin said that she herself is good, but she's very cruel. Ardian didn't do anything for him. Why do you treat him like that? Because they're afraid of the high school students. Rin said she doesn't know how good a race or clad are. But we can't let them get to all of them, so... Rin couldn't finish speaking when someone's body flew past her. She looked at him in fear. The other students were left open-mouthed in astonishment. Another treasure collapsed at their feet. Ladorsis looked toward the stage. Only Rude and Manon remained standing above her. Manon shouted, "Did she really think she could get to all of them? Chebel would definitely do something to him and that monster." Ruth stated coldly that he was tired of all the talking. Not the monster. He said that there are people who are being bullied and that he doesn't know how to respond. And there are those who gather in groups to intimidate a defenseless person. Rude asked Manon which of them she thought was the real monster, and then he answered his own question. It was him. Suddenly, a loud scream from Dia was heard. He was shouting his name. Rudd turned around when he heard the scream and saw a glowing sphere flying toward him. Rudd dodged it easily. The sphere hit Manon right on the forehead. The students were left speechless. Manon fell, leaving only Rude standing on the stage. Red didn't understand what had happened or who had thrown the last ball. In the sudden silence, footsteps could be heard. Rudd thought he had seen that man somewhere before. It was Professor Rowell. Rude remembered meeting her at the auction house. Then he fought against her in Shignement. Rudd was surprised to find out that she turned out to be Helios's teacher. The students were thrilled. Apparently, she was the one who threw the sphere and saved them. Professor Rowell turned to Rude. She asked why he had dodged the question. Professor Rowell told him not to chicken out this time, that she was interested. As she picked up a new sphere, she said he could easily place it, but he dodged her again. Dio couldn't believe his eyes. She was about to throw the sphere again. Professor Rowell told him not to chicken out this time, that she was interested. Rudd tried to stop her. Suddenly, other teachers entered the room. He looked around and saw a target that had been pierced from end to end. He saw Professor Rowell holding a manosphere in her hand. Professor Khan yelled at her, asking what she was doing. He looked around and saw a target that had been pierced from end to end, and the treasures were lying on the ground, many of them unconscious. Professor Khan, visibly shocked, asked Rowell if she had really done that. Donwei grabbed his head. What the hell was going on? He looked toward the stage and saw that Rudd was lying there next to the target. Professor Hale ordered that the doctors be called and that the students return to their classrooms. Lapis irritably told his companion that now everyone was staring at him and asking how long he would be there and if it was time for him to go back to his own territory. Study area for students of the Helios Eden School of Magic. The students from Eden's class watched the unusual guest with curiosity. Lapis irritably told his companion that now everyone was staring at him and asking how long he would be there and if it was time for him to go back to his own territory. His companion was a student from Carace's class. He said that most likely it wasn't his fault. He also asked Lapis where he thought his territory was, to which he replied that all of Helios was his territory. Everest said that during a private training session, he saw little Whoopi. He was so cute, and it seemed strange to him that he was turning into a terrifying monster. Lapis was outraged. He bragged about attending private training sessions. He said he had already mentioned that it wasn't anything significant. The story of how he met the Black Mage. Lapis hissed at him to lower his voice. He said he had already mentioned that it wasn't anything significant. He just ran into him by chance. That's all. Kara said he wanted to know everything in great detail. Who he was, what he liked, his hobbies, his style of dress, his favorite food. Lapis asked wearily what, in the end, he was actually trying to achieve. He replied that the Black Mage was the object of his admiration. He had already requested to meet with Opian several times, but each time his request was denied, as if the authorities were screening those petitions. Lapis and Runa were watching him. Lapis was lost in memories of the moment they teleported from the auction. The girl who was with the Black Mage, I think her name was Ren, said indignantly that she would definitely talk to the master about this situation. Lapis and Runa were watching him. Ren asked Blow if he was hurt, and he replied that he was perfectly fine. They were about to leave, but Lapis asked them to wait. Ren and the Black Mage turned around, surprised. Lapis then thought that an opportunity like this only comes once in a lifetime. She told the Black Mage that this might seem strange, but she wants to learn from him. The Black Mage looked at him in surprise. Lapis confirmed that he really wants to become the Black Mage's apprentice. He may have a tough road ahead, but his dream is to become as powerful as the Black Mage, and he'll do everything he can not to tarnish his reputation. But then Ren stopped him and said it was impossible. Lapis looked at her with a questioning expression. She explained that members of Opinion must focus exclusively on their missions and are forbidden from taking on disciples. Lapis had no choice but to accept the refusal. Now he remembered that story with embarrassment. Why did he open his mouth back then? Are you completely crazy? Adelio entered the room with his henchmen. Lapis's conversation partner greeted him and Anna. Adelio asked him in surprise if he was still in contact with that Eden student who had hit rock bottom. Lapis said that's the voice of someone who toys with power, someone among them who's fallen even lower. His conversation partner turned to Adelio and said that Lapis had called him a child. Adelio replied by saying it was pathetic and that he wasn't going to waste his time with him. He called Anna and the others and left. Lapis said sadly, "Who else here is pathetic? How long is this going to last?" His conversation partner asked him what he was talking about. It really bothered him. In one of the classrooms, Professor Khan and Professor Rowell were asking Ladorsis and Rudd what had happened. Professor Khan said that maybe they wouldn't believe him, but if they listened to what the students were saying, the damage suffered by the target and what happened to the high school students was all the work of a single person. He approached Ruth Christie and asked her if it was true. She replied that she didn't understand what he was referring to. Professor Rowell looked at her closely and suddenly asked, "He's a magician, isn't he?" Ladorsis looked at Professor Rowell in surprise. Ruth covered her face with her hands and frantically thought about what to do. Professor Khan asked what nonsense he was talking about. If Christie really was a magician, why was she acting that way? Ruth wondered if she had really acted too recklessly. It seemed like she sensed something, but he hadn't even used mana. Professor Rowell was watching him closely. Ruth said she had a terrible headache. Professor Khan became concerned and said she needed to go to the infirmary, but Rowell said she was fine. Khan asked how Professor Rowell knew that. Professor Rowell told her bluntly to stop lying. Ruth said in a weak voice that she didn't understand what they wanted from her. He was so surprised to see the sphere flying toward him that he doesn't remember anything else. Professor Rowell told her bluntly to stop lying. Lidorsis's eyes widened as he looked at her. Professor Khan announced that, at that moment, Professor Hale said he would punish the students involved in this incident. But until this issue is resolved, they can go back to class. Ruth decided that this time it seemed like she had managed to jump. Professor Rowell kept staring at him. Ruth also looked at her and thought that the fun would start soon. A group of clads with haggard faces stood in front of Sheeble. He asked why they looked like that. He followed their gaze and saw Ruth and Ladorsis walking, but suddenly they saw something and froze. Sheeble was outraged by everyone's strange behavior. He followed their gaze and saw Ruth and Ladorsis walking. Ladorsis saw him too. Sheeble called out to them rudely. Ruth Christie looked at him indifferently and then smiled at him. Sheeble was surprised and smiled. What the hell was going on? Ladorsis asked Ruth what she was doing, but she grabbed him by the shoulder and they walked past Sheeble with his entourage. Sheeble Hadelioth watched them leave. Ruth and Lydorsis walked on the hallway. Suddenly, Lydorsis stopped. Ruth turned around and asked what was wrong. Lydorsis said that from now on, a lot more things could happen. Because of him, a figure appeared in his mind, telling him that he needed to understand that he only brought misfortune. Lydorsis told Ruth that he would only bring her suffering. Ruth said that he was the one who had cursed him or something like that. She asked if he had seen what had happened before, but it wasn't his place to say. But even if there are 100 of them, it won't mean anything at all. And if something happens, it won't be his fault and he won't have any problems. So he needs to stop worrying about others and finally think about himself, about how he'll be able to move forward with such a gentle nature. Ladorsis replied that he didn't know everything. Ruth admitted that she didn't know what he was thinking or what was going on, and he doesn't seem willing to talk about it when asked directly. However, she can ask him for help, and now she doesn't dare to speak, so Ruth won't pay attention to her. Whatever it is, he'll help her. Ladorsis couldn't understand why she was doing that. She told Ruth that she didn't need his help and turned around to leave. Ruth let out a little laugh and said he had noticed, but Ladorsis had already run away from him again. Eden's class at Helio's School of Magic. Most of the students were confused. One of the girls voiced the general opinion by asking what would become of them now. The student next to her said that as a result of this incident, not only Clad, but also Karis had started ignoring them. Dia watched the students' reactions with discouragement. Why did they get involved in this? It's all this monster's fault. Why should everyone have to suffer because it's just one person? Now all the other students avoid them like they're bugs. The girl said she could ask the teacher to transfer them to another class, but they told her it would be better to make him stop coming to theirs. Dio couldn't help himself and indignantly asked what they were talking about. Suddenly, Ren stepped forward and loudly told everyone to shut up. The students looked at her in astonishment. Ren asked why everyone was so selfish and only thought about themselves. Because they feel bad when they're avoided, when they're treated the same way as Artian, based on how they think and how he feels. They really believe it's all his fault. They called him a monster and avoided him, but everyone knows the truth. They're just like those people. Rin stated that he's human too and that he has feelings as well. The student objected that she had seen it too. That day in the library, when the monster appeared, how can they pretend nothing happened? Rin hesitated to answer. But then another girl joined the conversation and said it was illusion magic. And he said he had heard that Sheeble specializes in illusion magic and has plenty of mana spheres. Since he was pretty skilled, it wasn't hard for him to show them this illusion. If Ardian had any problems, he wouldn't be at Helios. If they'd used their heads even a little, they would have realized it a long time ago. The students were stunned by her speech, and he added that they use the excuse that he's a monster and all that, but in reality, they're just afraid of Shabol and Harris. The student got indignant and said that he thought he was superior and that they were any better than them. And he agreed that she was just like him. But now the situation has changed. They were probably so shocked that they forgot about it. With Ruth Christie, things can change. The students listened to her in surprise. Suddenly, they discovered that Ladorsis was among them. His sudden appearance scared many of them. Ruth Christie followed him into the room and asked why he kept acting that way. All the students' eyes were on him. Ruth froze, not understanding what he had done to draw everyone's attention. Dio hurried over to him, asking if everything was okay. Ruth said he felt a little dizzy, but Dio cut him off and said he wasn't asking about him, but about the treasures and what the professors had said. He replied that they had talked too much and that he really hadn't understood them. Ladorsis tried to take the opportunity to escape, but Ruth stopped him. And he turned to them and said, "Monster." He immediately corrected himself. That's his name, Ladorsis. And Ruth Christie, she reached out her hand to him. Another student joined the conversation. He added that, of course, it was a bit late, but he hoped they would get along. Ladorsis remained still, but Rude shook the outstretched hand. Another student joined the conversation. He said his name was Noiden, and they asked him how he had managed to surpass the magical target, and also if, by training hard, they could become like him. More and more students were gathering around Ruth and Ladorsis. They told Rude that he used to be a very unapproachable person. They reminded him how he had stopped the magic sphere in the classroom. The pair of students who started this unpleasant conversation were perplexed, not understanding what they were thinking or what the point was in talking to him. Some students approached Arkin. They reminded him how he had stopped the magic sphere in the classroom and thanked him for it. Chubble asked him why he had done that, but didn't press him about it. He seemed much better than expected. Manon was in the infirmary. Chubble and Anna were sitting by her bed. Chubble remembered telling Professor Hale that he had nothing to do with the incident. Manon apologized and said she would take responsibility for everyone. Chubble interrupted and said, "Great. Since everything had already happened, there was nothing that could be done, so he should just remember it." Chubble remembered telling Professor Hale that he had nothing to do with the incident. Professor Hale said he believed him, but that he had to understand. In that case, there's nothing wrong with extending the sentence for Manon and the rest of the Sordas according to the rules and regulations. Chubble asked him directly what he wanted. Professor Hale observed with satisfaction that he understood him very well. Manon called out to him when she saw Cheval lost in thought. Chubble said he had heard that Eden was planning to hold an off-campus training session and would be taking some students with him. He doesn't know Professor Hale's intentions, but this is the perfect opportunity to prove what he's capable of to anyone who challenges him. Manon looked at Chubble again. She said it with that damn Ruth Christie. No matter how much she thinks about it, he's definitely not an ordinary student. So she decided Chubble should know. Ruth and Ladorsis were sleeping in their room. Anna tried to calm things down and told her not to worry about trivial matters and to stop thinking about it. Chubble said he would soon share some interesting news with them. Ruth and Lita's sources were sleeping in their round. Ruth wondered if she was doing everything right. Even though it was a chaotic day, she managed to improve her relationships with her classmates. Ladorsis also started communicating with them. Ruth looked at Ladorsis, who was sleeping, and things started to gather near Ladorsis's bed. But she hoped that at least today something had changed for the better. Suddenly, black smoke seeped into their room through a crack in the window and began to gather near Ladorsus's bed. The smoke took the shape of a strange black figure that said, "This'll happen soon." But the figure quickly dissipated and the black smoke vanished. Ruth wondered what it was and what effect it had on Ladorsus. However, it's unlikely that this is the same problem as Chebel's. What happened to this guy? Dawn is broken at the Helios School of Magic. However, it's unlikely that this is the same problem as Chebel's. What happened to this guy? Dawn has broken at the Helios School of Magic. The students talked about the upcoming field training exercises. They were excited because they were about to face monsters. Ruth and Lydorsus also left their room. Ruth hadn't slept well because of the story about the Black Shadow and was yawning slightly. Two students saw them and greeted them. Ladorsus looked at them and walked by in silence. The girls looked at him, surprised. Then Ruth walked up to them and greeted me with a sweet smile. Then she called out to Lydors and told him that when someone greets you, you should greet them back. Ruth tried to talk to him about what happened last night, but he just looked at her, confused. Ruth said everything was fine and that it didn't matter, but she kept thinking about what had happened yesterday. She was sure it was magic. He had disappeared without a trace, but it was unlikely that Lydorsus knew anything about it. Ruth remembered that he said something was about to happen. She felt that danger was coming and wondered if she should report it to the school, but she had no proof. Ruth decided that she should talk to the teacher about this first. She snapped out of her thoughts and suddenly saw that Ladorsus was standing. Ruth asked if he had been waiting for her since she stopped, but yesterday she had been avoiding him. It seemed like his opinion had changed. Ruth heard someone calling her and saw Dio running toward him. Dio ran up and greeted Artian as well. Ruth told Ladorsus to say hi to her. Ladorsus said to Dio, "Hi." Dio thought that from the outside, it looked pretty funny. More classmates came over to them and told Ruth that Professor Rowell was looking for him and would probably be back soon. Then the three of them kept walking, arguing about which of them would be the first to enter the classroom. He and Ladorsus kept walking, and Ruth asked Dio if he was going to go with them. Dio agreed. Then the three of them kept walking, arguing about which of them would be the first to enter the classroom. Professor Hale informed the class that the hordes involved in the recent incident would be dealt with accordingly. He expressed his hope that this wouldn't happen again in the future and that this incident would remain just a bad memory. Helios will also take additional measures to improve training, allowing students to focus on preparing for practical training. Professor Hale added that they don't know what might happen there. After class, the three of them sat in the cafeteria, and Dio said dejectedly that it was even possible to prepare for an encounter with a monster. Rude suggested that they would probably have to defeat specially trained monsters, but Dio said it wouldn't be that hard. Ruth wondered what it could be. He was sure that the difficulty would be adjusted to the student's level. In the end, he decided not to dwell on it any further. The Ladorsus case was much more important. Suddenly, Professor Rowell appeared behind Ruth and shouted her name loudly. Theo and Lydorsus looked at her alone. Professor Rowell told Rude to follow her. He looked at her in surprise. At that moment, Princess Utiarnan was talking with Ram. She told him that Tessie had found something interesting. And so she begins her field training, and she goes with her. Ram shouted in surprise and alarm at what she was doing. Meanwhile, Professor Rowell was dragging Ruth along with her. Training arena of the Helios School of Magic. Lapis asked why everyone was gathered there, and they told her that Professor Rowell was going to fight a student from Eden. Lapis was extremely surprised and asked exactly who it was. "I think the guy everyone is talking about right now is named Ruth Christie." Ruth Christie stood there, silently staring at the wooden training sword she held in her hands. She didn't understand how she had ended up in that situation. Dio stepped forward and declared that he couldn't believe Professor Rowell was going to fight someone who hadn't done anything wrong to her, but she advised him to stay out of it. Dio replied, "All right," and hid behind Ladorsus. He asked her to make sure nothing happened to Riz. Ruth had a feeling that something like this might happen. Who would have thought she'd be so stubborn? The students gathered there watched what was happening in confusion. Rude decided that, either way, it was awesome. It was a great opportunity to show everyone just how ordinary he was and make them lose interest in him. Professor Rowell said, "Let's begin." And he took up a fighting stance. Ruth indignantly asked why he had a wooden sword while she had a real one. But she advised him to use magic, and that way there wouldn't be any problems. He tried to say it was unfair, but Professor Rowell had already lunged at him. He decided he had to let her hurt him so he could lose. But her attack was too fierce, and he dodged it by reflex. Ruth thought that if she hit him, he wouldn't get away with just a simple injury. So he kept avoiding her and tried not to talk to her. A student standing next to Lapis noticed that this student from Eden was dodging all of the professor's attacks. Professor Rowell yelled at him to fight, saying she wasn't going to give him a break, and she attacked him again. Dio, who was watching the fight with Lindorsis, shouted at him to be careful. Rude blocked Rowell's strike with his wooden sword. He thought his reflexes were kicking in again, and there was no way to stop it. His wooden sword couldn't withstand the blow and broke. Comrade Leopis exclaimed that it was amazing. Lindorsis stepped forward and used her hand to push Professor Rowell's sword aside. She told him not to interrupt him, that it was dangerous. Dio shouted that it was dangerous anyway. His sword broke in half. Rowell replied that it wouldn't break if he used magic. Rude said he wouldn't compete with her, and Rowell asked why. He replied that, first of all, he didn't want to, and second, he didn't have the skills for it. Lapis's friend said it was really amazing, that he'd never seen the professor so excited. Professor Rowell said she didn't accept his refusal. Lapis's companion said he saw Rude block the professor's sword. Even without magic, he managed to withstand such brutal attacks. Professor Rowell told Rude he could take up his sword, but he refused. Lapis gathered her courage and stepped forward. She spoke up loudly to Professor Rowell and declared that instead of forcing someone to practice combat who wasn't interested, he could fight someone who would be honored to attend his magnificent private lessons. Lapis said she wanted to study with her, but she briefly replied no. Lapis was desperate. He had been rejected again, and in such a rude way. Ruth thought she had seen him somewhere before. Professor Rowell turned to Ruth Christie and said they had gotten too distracted, so they would continue next time. As he left, he added that they would still have plenty of time. The four of them watched Rowell as he walked away. Then Dio suddenly thought, why are there four of us? And he looked at Rin, who was standing next to him. She explained that because of the noise, she thought something had happened and asked Ruth if she was okay. Dio replied that Professor Rowell had just tried to kill Rude, but otherwise everything was fine. Lapis, surrounded by friends, was still hurt by another rejection, but she didn't hesitate for a second. Ruth thought that it was definitely her who was at the auction at that moment. Dio showed Rin the remains of Rude's sword and told her that it had broken in half. She asked him if he was sure he was okay. She explained that she was there because she was worried about Rude and introduced herself. Her name is Rin Noah. Ruth asked her if she had received letters from Ben. Rin said that she knew it was him. Ben mentioned it in his letters. Rin thanked Ruth enthusiastically for delivering the letters. Then, everyone heard someone shouting Rin's name. It was her friend who came running over and asked what was going on and why so many people were gathered there. They explained that some unexpected circumstances had come up. Professor Rowell called out to Rude and challenged him to a sword duel. Ruth looked at Lindorsis and said he was only alive thanks to him, and thanked him for closing it. Dio said Ruth was right. If it hadn't been for Artien, everything could have ended badly. Ruth asked Lindorsis how this had happened, since he was standing right behind him. He replied that even if he had been just a step away from her, he would have blocked it anyway, and smiled. Everyone was amazed. They saw Lindorsis smile for the first time. At the magic school, Helios talked about the upcoming practical training. The headmaster asked if everything had been arranged with the tower. They answered yes and added that nothing significant had changed. The headmaster reviewed the list of Kreese community members who would accompany the younger students. Among its members were Shevla von Jadalio and Anna Verp, also Linus Grimm and Cynthia S. The headmaster asked, There are only 4 of them? And he looked thoughtfully at the name Shovel von Gedelio. They told him that there were no classes at that time, so finding someone at the school would be pretty difficult. The headmaster asked why Shovel von Gedelio had been included. Professor Hale replied that the Eden's training would have a different format this time. This is the first time so many people are being teleported and the activities are being coordinated with the tower. He anticipated that unforeseen situations might arise and therefore selected the most suitable people from among the creases. He added that he had not made this decision lightly and that he hoped Delia would learn a lot from these field exercises. The director expressed his hope that he had made the right decision and asked what had happened with the teleporter. He replied that everything was fine. The director said that was great. Let's hope these field exercises strengthen the relationship between the tower and Helios. He added that he hopes the teachers accompanying her will do everything in their power. Night fell over Helios, and Ruth was sitting on the rooftop of the building. He tried to contact the master using the magic stone. Ruth wondered why the master wasn't answering, because he always responded when needed, but now there was so much to tell him. He decided to quickly return to the room just in case that black entity showed up again. After its appearance, everything became much more complicated for him. He also thought about the Lidorsis. Things are going pretty well for her. Little by little, she started to open up. Ruth wondered what to do next, since she couldn't contact the master. And suddenly she saw Lidorsis sitting in a chair. She asked why he wasn't sleeping and started talking about how she had gone out for a little walk. The breeze outside was pleasantly refreshing. She asked if maybe he wanted to go with her next time. Lidorsis said he thought he had died. Ruth replied that she was in her room now, so where could she have gone? But Lidorsis quietly approached his bed and went to bed. Ruth thought that Lidorsis' behavior was scaring her. When they both lay down, Ruth decided to talk about the field training. Normally, teams of 4 people are formed, and if there aren't any changes this time, they might end up on the same team. But Lidorsis didn't respond. Ruth asked what was going on with Dio. Lidorsis said that if he joins them, there will be 3, and they'll need 1 more participant. Ruth asked if he didn't care about his grades. Before falling asleep, he said they really needed 1 more member. It was raining at Artium Castle. Lady Diner was standing by the window when Lisbon approached her. She told him that, for some reason, she had a bad feeling. A carrier pigeon flew to the house on the cliff. It dropped the letter. It was caught by a girl with horns, Ruby Monner. She figured they had found something and started to read the letter. But in it, the recipient commented that the food had been excellent, that they had played with other people that day, that the activities hadn't been enjoyable, that the room felt stuffy, and that they wanted to go home. Ruby Monner was furious.